After a thrill-filled day of successfully evading the cops on his bike, Han Se-gun returned home as if it were any other Tuesday. But the moment he stepped inside, he was hit by the metallic stench of blood. The floor was stained a deep crimson, trailing from the very entrance. Someone had clearly breached his sanctuary. He grabbed the nearest weapon, his mind racing as he searched the silence for his family. Suddenly, a blur of fur lunged at him. It was the family dog, but something was horribly wrong. Han hit the floor, struggling to keep the snapping jaws away from his throat. With a desperate heave, he threw the animal off and found his footing. When the dog lunged again, Han didn't hesitate. One heavy strike to the head ended its life. The grief of losing his pet was sharp, but the need for answers was sharper. As he turned his head, the world shattered. His parents lay on the floor, their fates already cruelly decided. The gore was enough to make his stomach churn, but his grief was cut short by a heavy creak from the second floor. The intruder was still here, lingering in the shadows. Realizing a simple stick wouldn't cut it against whatever did this, Han bolted for his father's study to find the weapon kept there. But the nightmare only deepened. His brother sat slumped in front of the shelf, already gone. Han held his brother for a fleeting second, whispering an apology for being absent while the world fell apart. Then he stilled his resolve. He grabbed the weapon and loaded it, swearing to hunt down every last soul responsible for this massacre. But as he ascended the stairs, the air grew heavy. He realized too late that whatever caused this level of destruction defied all common sense. Standing before him was a towering creature, a monstrosity that made him realize he hadn't just found the killer. He had walked straight into death's front door. Han felt a deep wave of fear wash over him as he stared at the towering creature standing directly in front of him. Trying to steady his trembling hands, Han took his gun, pointed it directly at the creature, and squeezed the trigger. The loud crack of the firearm echoed through the room, but the creature instantly dodged the incoming projectile and dashed toward him with a ferocious gaze. With incredible speed, the beast closed the distance and struck Han hard across his arm, the immense force of the blow propelling him straight into the wall beside him. The heavy impact left Han completely disoriented, his senses reeling as he tumbled down the flight of stairs. His grip failing as the gun slipped from his hand and clattered onto the floor. Lying dazed on the hard ground, Han struggled to grasp his situation and make sense of the chaos. He pulled himself together through the intense pain. He turned his gaze back toward the creature, recognizing that he could not run away from this danger. As the beast crept closer, drooling heavily from its mouth with a desperate, hungry look, it glared down at Han. In a normal situation, Han could have called the police or asked people nearby for help, but when this tragedy actually struck, not a single one of those thoughts could enter his mind. He did not know why his instincts took over, but he tried to steady his breaking resolve as he rose up slowly from the ground. In that moment, our boy seemed to have no thought remaining in his mind other than an absolute desire to end the life of the thing in front of him. The creature suddenly dashed forward again. Han screamed loudly, hurling some choice words at the monstrosity as he retrieved the weapon and fired the gun once more. The bullet struck the creature squarely in its body, but the beast did not seem to feel any pain from the impact. In a swift, brutal form of retaliation, the creature swung its heavy arm downward, striking Han straight on his hand with such immense force that the limb was completely severed from his body. Han watched in absolute shock, staring at his own hand flying through the air away from his torso. He realized right then that this situation was far more than what he could handle. As the creature stood there glaring, Han's severed arm fell heavily to the ground, and the sheer agony and terror overtook him. In that exact moment, the creature reached out, grabbed Han firmly by the head and pulled him up into the air, putting him in a completely vulnerable, helpless position as it stared directly into his eyes. Through all of this, the creature remained entirely silent, never uttering a single word. Han was crying heavily now, the tears streaming down his face as he grasped that he could not even get proper revenge for his family. The creature paid no attention to his grief and began to swing its powerful arm to deliver the final, fatal attack. But suddenly, a loud bang shattered the air as a bullet went flying through the room, striking the creature straight in the arm. The unexpected impact caught the beast completely by surprise, causing it to scream out in pain as its grip loosened, letting Han fall heavily back to the ground. Through the doorway, a man walked calmly into the space, holding a gun firmly in his right arm. He glared back at the screaming creature and mentioned that the beast had finally gone and done it. Before the monster could make another move, the stranger pointed his gun once more and unleashed a rapid barrage of gunfire. The creature was left completely defenseless under the assault. It was clear that these were no ordinary bullets. Han could only lay there flat on the ground, crying heavily as he watched the incredible display of violence unfolding right in front of him. The creature sustained multiple heavy attacks, unable to do anything but take the damage as it stared at its attacker. In that same movement, the man swiftly pulled out a sharp sword and sliced through the creature, and the man completely cut the entity down, tearing its physical form into pieces. Within moments, the creature's severed body began to burn brightly on the floor. The white-haired man then turned and began to walk slowly toward Han, who was still slumped on the ground. The man looked down, glaring at the wounded youth. Han felt an overwhelming wave of fear toward this stranger. He was completely unable to walk anywhere due to his severe injuries. The man looked at him coldly and spoke, stating that there is no one righteous, and that everyone on earth is a sinner. He then told Han to resent him, placing the cold edge of his sword directly against Han's neck. As he said this, the man's eyes drifted down to Han's severed hand lying on the floor. He noticed that the fingers of the detached hand were actually still hooked around the trigger of the gun, causing him to understand that Han had truly been fighting for his life until the very last second. Intrigued by the sight, the man addressed Han, asking him just one thing: whether that gun belonged to him. Upon hearing the question, Han tried to look up, but his sight began to blur heavily as he stared at the white-haired man, and he slowly lost consciousness, drifting into total darkness. The man felt a wave of annoyance as he glared down at the unconscious boy. He began to wonder if perhaps Han was simply too good to kill right then, and so he decided to leave him there alive. For Han, a life that had once been lived with no real worries was now completely shattered. After some time passed, the bright morning light began to filter into the ruined house. Someone finally entered the building and found Han lying on the ground, immediately screaming out for help. It was the police. The officers moved in quickly, crowding around his body, asking if he was okay and if he could hear their voices. The officer then called out to the men waiting outside, shouting that they had found a survivor over here and urging them to send more people into the house immediately. Han lay there as the medical team began to move him. The news carried the incident, stating that 1 week ago, an incident had occurred that caused quite a stir. The anchor explained that a mysterious family had been found deceased, and the second son was the sole survivor of the tragedy. The man responded that their production team was focusing heavily on the fact that the survivor, Han, was holding a shotgun at the time of the incident, and testimonies existed confirming that Han had actually fired the weapon. The media team also spoke with Han's acquaintances. One friend mentioned that Han was quite well known in the local biking scene, adding that while he was not exactly a thug, he definitely carried a sketchy vibe. This was the narrative being spun about Han, and as a result, the public grew incredibly eager to demand answers from him. Han soon found himself surrounded by a sea of flashing lenses, noting that he had never seen so many faces directed at him in his entire life. As he stood there immobile, reporters began hurling multiple questions at him, demanding to know the truth of what happened, why he had fired the shotgun, and what reason could have driven him to desire the end of his family so badly. One reporter stepped forward into his space, telling him to give them a statement. In that exact moment, Han experienced a sudden, disorienting flashback. The man standing directly in front of him appeared to transform into the towering creature he had recently witnessed in his home. Han grew thoroughly frightened as the image of the monster flashed before his eyes. The reporter, noticing his reaction, questioned what was wrong, asking if he wasn't the one who had wanted this situation to happen, asking how someone who rode his bike so carelessly while his family was being systematically eliminated could possibly believe he deserved to feel anger. The memory was incredibly vivid, filling him with a deep terror that caused him to step back slowly. Without another word, he turned and bolted, running away from the crowd while repeating that it was not like that. He was running blindly from a feeling he could not even identify, or perhaps he simply did not want to acknowledge the reality of what had occurred. He ran as fast as his legs could carry him, crying heavily as the immense emotional weight took its toll, refusing to believe that his experience was real. By the time he fully came to his senses, the physical evidence had vanished. The creature's remains were gone without a trace, and his severed arm was strangely reattached to his torso. It felt as though everything he had experienced on that horrific day was an absolute lie, as if the stillness of the world was telling him to simply forget the passing of his family, the monster he had encountered, and the white-haired stranger who had saved his life at the nick of time. Unable to face the outside world, Han stayed confined within his house, frequently standing at the exact spot where his parents had fallen. feeling the pressure of the cameras waiting outside, knowing that absolutely no one would believe him even if he spoke the truth. One evening he decided he could no longer remain cooped up in the residence, as the rooms held too many painful memories. He arrived at his house's garage, where his motorcycle was parked. Feeling completely down, and recognizing that he had no one left to lean on either inside or outside of his home, he decided to clear his head. And so he took the bike and went for a long ride into the evening. He traveled a great distance away from the neighborhood. Upon arriving at a remote destination, he parked the motorcycle, removed his helmet, and looked toward the horizon. Before him lay a massive cityscape filled with towering skyscrapers and the gleaming lights of urban nightlife. The view was beautiful, but his attention was suddenly arrested by a figure in the surroundings. Han froze in shock. Standing a short distance away was the exact white-haired man who had rescued him during the attack. The man looked back at him with a stern expression, slowly walking away. Reacting quickly, Han drove his motorcycle forward, maneuvered the vehicle to block the stranger's path instantly, and stated that it was him. Han mentioned that he was absolutely sure of it, adding that the man had come to his house on the day the monster attacked. Upon hearing this, the man, whose name was Sylvester, raised his voice and firmly told Han to be quiet, shouting that he was an absolute nuisance to everyone around him and instructing him not to scream in the middle of the night. Han consciously calmed himself down, asking Sylvester who he exactly was and what that creature was supposed to be. Sylvester responded by telling him to use his own imagination. Han reasoned that the man might be an exorcist, to which Sylvester replied that he was close. Han then deduced that the monster he saw must have been a vampire. Sylvester paused for a brief second, observing the boy, before confirming that Han was correct in his reasoning. Sylvester stated that since the conversation had reached this point, he would get straight to the facts. He asked Han directly if he had ingested any of the vampire's blood. Han looked away, his eyes drifting down to his reattached hand as he remembered the confrontation. He recalled that some blood had splattered when the monster was shot, asking Sylvester if he was going to turn into a vampire as well if he had accidentally swallowed some. Sylvester confirmed that it was a distinct possibility. Han felt a profound wave of bewilderment and agony wash over him, looking at his limb and mentioning that his arm must be altered too. Sylvester corrected him, stating that he had personally reattached the arm himself. Han replied that such a thing sounded completely ridiculous. Sylvester countered by asking if anything Han had witnessed with his own eyes made any sort of conventional sense. Han adjusted to the reality, asking if there were still many of those vampires remaining out there. Sylvester turned his back to Han, stating that whether they remained or not was absolutely none of his concern, adding that what Han needed to do right now was simply return to his normal life. The response sparked instant anger in Han. He screamed at Sylvester, asking if he truly believed such a thing was even possible when he had lost every single aspect of a normal existence. He demanded to know how in the world he was supposed to just return to a normal life after everything that had happened. In response to the outburst, Sylvester stepped forward, tightly grabbed Han by the fabric of his shirt, and lifted him completely off the ground. Our boy struggled against the iron grip, glaring fiercely into Sylvester's eyes. Sylvester stared back coldly, telling Han to quit his whining, and asking if he truly thought he was someone special, noting that he was far from the only person in the world who had experienced terrible luck. Han, suspended in the air, asked what he was supposed to do then, as he instantly smacked Sylvester's hand off of his jacket, stating that he had seen that monster with his own 2 eyes as it consumed his entire family. He asked how he could possibly continue living his life and simply forget that it occurred, crying out that he was entirely unable to do so. Sylvester stood perfectly still under the night sky, watching the raw emotion vibrating through the youth. Han swore that he was going to wipe every single one of them out, stating that he would eliminate them completely, even if it cost him his own life. Han stood there trembling, consumed by absolute pain and anger under the darkness. Sylvester glared down at him for a quiet moment, observing the display before softly remarking how much of a troublesome guy Han was proving to be. The sharp ring of a bell cut through the quiet atmosphere of the cafe as the front door swung open. Inside, the proprietor and a lone customer turned their gazes toward the entrance to see who had arrived. The lady immediately grew ecstatic upon seeing Sylvester cross the threshold, greeting him warmly by the name of Sylvie. Sylvester walked directly up to her counter, mentioning firmly that he had already instructed her not to address him by that name. The lady smiled, noting that it appeared he had brought a guest along with him this time. The man who had been sitting quietly at the table stood up, turning his attention toward the youth accompanying Sylvester. He addressed Han, observing that he must be the kid who was known to have survived the incident back then. Sylvester ignored the remark, turning his focus to the man to ask what had come of the matter they had previously discussed. The man explained that the individual they were looking for appeared to have left Korea entirely. Upon hearing this, Sylvester sat down, a look of annoyance settling over his features as he reasoned that they had missed their target once again. After a brief pause in the conversation, the man looked over at Han and asked Sylvester why he had even bothered to bring that friend along with him, noting that the boy looked far too frail to be deployed for their kind of work right now. Sylvester responded by reminding the man that he should already know from his own experience that fighting monsters is simply not something humans are naturally meant to do. Turning his gaze directly onto Han, Sylvester explained that the very moment a person lets their guard down, a vampire will snap their bones and tear completely through their muscles. He questioned how humans could possibly expect to fight against entities of that nature without assistance. Sylvester reached into his gear and presented a specific medicine, showing it to Han. He explained that the substance was known as psychedelic moon. He stated that in order to fight against vampires, a human must ingest this medicine, as it ensures the sensation of pain diminishes and allows a person to utilize physical strength several times greater than normal. However, he cautioned that the more a person relies on it, the more their physical body will break down. He added that an individual will eventually depend entirely on the power until they die alone in the end, given that the medicine is manufactured directly from vampire blood. Sylvester warned that one wrong move could cause Han to become one of the very creatures he hated. He glared at Han, asking if he still desired to pursue his revenge under these conditions. He made it entirely clear that once a person steps into the absolute darkness of the night, they can never return to reality. Han's mind was already made, though. He instantly reached out and grabbed the medicine directly from Sylvester's hand. Han stated that his current existence was already exactly the same anyway, leaving him with nothing to lose. Before he could actually ingest the substance, Sylvester swiftly caught Han's hand, stopping the movement as he asked the boy what he thought he was doing and demanding to know who had told him to consume it right now. Their interaction was interrupted as both men turned their attention toward another individual who had suddenly walked into the cafe. The stranger observed the two of them, remarking that Han was a total nut job. He laughed, mentioning that it was good because it showed the kid had serious guts. This man was Song Deok-yeon, an experienced vampire hunter. Sylvester turned to him, stating that he was leaving the kid in his care, instructing Deok-yeon to make sure Han became strong enough to keep himself from dying. Deok-yeon accepted the responsibility. He then reached out, grabbed Han firmly by the head, and welcomed him to the world of the Mad Moon. Sylvester stood up from his seat, turning to his associate to instruct Xionghui to arrange a boat to Mexico right away. Han looked thoroughly confused by the sudden development. He quickly ran out of the building to meet Sylvester before he could depart, asking if he was truly going abroad and questioning why the person training him wasn't going to be Sylvester himself. Sylvester looked back at him, remarking that it was unbelievable that Han had assumed otherwise. He then looked at Deok-yeon, asking if he truly believed he could make the boy useful. Deok-yeon stated that he'd simply have to try his best. Sylvester turned back to Han one last time. He spoke firmly, welcoming Han Se-gun to the world of the Mad Moon. 1 year later, outside the Benia Club, several vehicles sat parked along the pavement. A man stepped forward to open the door of one of the cars as a prominent figure emerged. This was Cheon Young-hoo, the underboss of the Sangdong gang. As he walked toward the entrance of the establishment, the subordinates gathered outside bowed deeply in respect. The manager of the club dashed out from the interior to greet him, calling out to him as Young Nim. Cheon Young, who stopped immediately, patted the manager by the shoulder and cautioned him. He told the man not to call him that, reminding him that he had explicitly instructed everyone to address him as senior moving forward. He added that they were supposed to be respectable businessmen running a proper, legitimate business now. The manager smiled quickly, nodding and confirming that the senior was absolutely correct. Cheon Young, who then inquired why the manager had called him out to the club in the first place, mentioning that he was exceptionally busy with his duties these days. The manager began to explain the situation, but before he could finish his sentence, the scene shifted completely into the center of the building. Inside the main room of the Benia Club, a large group of gang members lay scattered across the floor, completely beat up and groaning in pain. In the exact center of the destruction stood a young man wearing a very distinct, strange getup. He looked entirely confident as he stood unmoved in the midst of the chaos. The moment Cheon Young-hoo walked into the room, he froze in absolute shock. He looked at the wreckage and asked the manager if he had actually called him down there just because of a single kid. yelling at the manager and asking why he couldn't manage the property properly, causing the manager to begin apologizing profusely to his superior. Cheon-young, who glared across the room at Han, studying his appearance. He noted to himself that this was the individual who had completely wrecked their entire hideout, expressing surprise because he had been led to believe the culprit was a foreigner, whereas the youth in front of him looked incredibly young. Han slowly turned his gaze toward him. Cheon-young, who screamed at him, asking if he was finally finished throwing his little tantrum. Our boy wasn't sweating the numbers at all. Cheon-young, who walked deeper into the room, telling Han that in all his years, he had never seen a thug like him operating so recklessly in a free democratic city. He mentioned that if Han wanted something, he should have used his words like a civilized person, demanding to know what he thought he was doing, especially since the club was scheduled to open soon. Han looked at the older man, repeating the word thug with a calm smile. He explained that he had clearly paid a cash deposit for an order, but the gang had failed to deliver the promised goods to him. He asked if that wasn't more than enough reason for him to take this kind of action. Cheon-young, who looked genuinely confused, asking what goods he was talking about. Han responded, asking if the executive was seriously going to pretend he didn't know about the transaction. Han smiled further, revealing that 5 million won in cash had been handed directly to one of Cheon-young-hoo's minions. He noted that if an executive remained completely ignorant of such dealings, then this was nothing more than a total thug organization. Cheon-young, who was taken aback by the revelation, turned sharply to the terrified manager, demanding to know what the boy was talking about and asking what goods had been promised. Before the manager could answer, Han spoke up clearly, listing his requested items as a Dragunov sniper rifle, a Tokarev pistol, and an AK-47. Upon hearing the names of the weapons, he shouted at Han, asking if he had truly expected to receive all of those military-grade firearms for a mere 5 million won. He asked the green little punk if he had any real understanding of how much those weapons actually cost, questioning if he even comprehended the words coming out of his own mouth. Han looked at him directly, asking what there was to understand. He questioned if Cheon-young-hoo was referring to the fact that the Songdo gang regularly hoarded Russian and Chinese weapons to distribute them illegally. He continued to berate the executive, adding that the gang consistently charged several times the actual market price for their smuggled inventory anyway. Cheon-young-hoo's face darkened as he glared at Han, asking why he was even wasting his breath talking to a brat. He turned his back to walk away, instructing his remaining men to simply report Han to the police and hand him over to the authorities. As the executive began to walk off, Han called out to him, asking if he was truly going to be okay with that decision. Han stated directly to Cheon-young-hoo that while his damn Songdo gang openly sold knives and guns, he might just happen to spill to the authorities that they were actively distributing illegal drugs now as well. The threat hit home instantly. Cheon-young-hoo stopped in his tracks, his eyes widening in fury. He screamed out to his subordinates at the top of his lungs, demanding to know what they were standing around for, and ordering them to chop Han up right now in order to silence him permanently. At his command, the two guards went down towards Han, pulling out their weapons as they began to walk up to him. Han glared at them, flexing his hands and getting his body ready for the fight that was about to unfold. The first man lunged forward and swung a heavy bat, but Han executed a controlled movement to dodge the attack, instantly dashing towards the second man in a haste. The second man held a knife firmly in his hand and thrusted the blade forward. Before the strike could connect, Han had already dodged the attack and struck the man straight in the face with a heavy punch. The moment Han struck the first guy in his face, he intuitively sensed that the second guy was coming from behind. As that guard swung, Han shifted his weight to dodge the incoming trajectory, turning sharply to deliver the heavy punch to the side that sent the man crashing to the floor. With the guards incapacitated, Han turned his attention toward Cheon-young-hoo. The executive was clearly taken aback, realizing that Han had handled his men without assistance. Han walked steadily upstairs until he arrived directly in front of Cheon-young-hoo, staring him down. Cheon-young-hoo looked at him and asked what exactly he wanted. Han reiterated his terms, stating that he wanted the Dragunov sniper rifle, the Tokarev pistol, and the AK-47, adding that Cheon-young-hoo should simply bring the weapons to him since the cash deposit had already been paid. Upon hearing this, Cheon-young-hoo laughed at the demand, stating that while he understood, Han had to know they couldn't make the trade right this second for the drop-off. Han walked off calmly and stated that the meeting would take place tomorrow at 8 p.m. He informed the executive that the location was the Yondo Hyunshin Securities parking lot, leaving the club behind. The moment Han crossed the threshold, Cheon-young-hoo's expression darkened, calling him a blood-clad bastard. The club manager tried to interject, stepping forward to ask if he was all right, addressing him as Sanbei. In a fit of sheer annoyance, Cheon-young, who turned and slapped the manager across the face, shouting that he was supposed to call him senior. He turned his gaze back toward the exit Han had used, stating to the manager that it appeared there was no other choice but to help those guys get here. The scene then cut to a completely different space. Inside, a row of blood bags was arranged properly along a workspace. A few men were inside conversing about the trade, one of them pointing out that the current supply was nothing but trash, noting that most of the blood brought to him didn't even possess a VT of 20, known as Vampire Translate, represented the specific potency required to transform an adult human male into a vampire. Song Deokyeon stood directly in front of the speaker. The man looked at him, repeating that most of the blood brought in wasn't even a VT of 20, adding that most of the runs running wild these days were from the Gangdong gang, observing that, even for mutts, that specific level was way too low, asking the man if he had perhaps tampered with the testing machine. The man took offense to the implication, telling Song Deokyeon that if he didn't trust the results, he could gladly take his business somewhere else, asking if he truly believed the machine was some ordinary piece of junk. Song Deokyeon quickly brushed off the tension, mentioning that he was just talking, and telling the old man that he clearly couldn't take a joke. This older individual was Old Man Ju, a known dealer who traded in vampire blood within Korea. Old Man Ju handed the bag over to Song Deokyeon, telling him to stop yapping and just take the money. He then shifted the conversation, mentioning that he had heard the news about a man named Jung Jin, whose entire family had been killed by vampires. He asked if Song Deokyeon had still been unable to reach him since the incident. Song Deokyeon looked away, asking why he was bringing up such an unlikely name. He reasoned that the guy was probably off somewhere happily swinging his sword, adding that honestly, the man could go ahead and become a vampire for all he cared. Song Deokyeon stated that he was off, turning on his heel to walk away from the counter. Old Man Ju watched his departure, observing quietly to himself that the hunter was never truly honest with his own feelings. Outside the building, the cool air filled the space as Song Deokyeon walked up to his vehicle. He stopped when he recognized that Han was waiting in front of him. Song Deokyeon looked at the youth. He scrutinized Han's appearance, asking if he had gone off and gotten into a physical fight somewhere. Han looked away, responding that he had not. Song Deokyeon asked him why he was avoiding his eyes then. He walked up to the rear of his vehicle, popped the boot open, and carefully placed the blood bag inside. Han watched the movement, choosing that moment to ask if he could finally start accompanying him to catch vampires. Song Deokyeon shut down the idea immediately, stating that with his current skills, Han was nowhere near ready. He called him a punk, warning him not to get any funny ideas and to keep his focus entirely on his training. He added that he knew Han was simply itching for action because his technical skills had improved a bit, but cautioned him not to go causing trouble with the wrong people for no reason. Han looked down at the ground, mentioning that Song Deokyeon worried far too much and promising that such a thing wouldn't happen. Song Deokyeon accepted the answer, stating that if he understood, then that was that. Han hesitated for a second. He asked what he should do if a situation arose where there was a definitive need to kill a person. Song Deokyeon stopped, looking at him firmly before responding that he should just kill them. He explained that if the premise of the situation dictated that killing was absolutely necessary, then there was nothing else to consider, though he admitted he did not know in what specific scenario it would be necessary to take a human life. Han nodded slowly. Suddenly, Song Deokyeon reached out and grappled Han in a playful neck choke, laughing as he called him a rascal and accusing him of thinking about something entirely different. He then suggested they head over to the gym to sweat it out in the ring for the first time in a while. Han wriggled free, stating flatly, "No thanks." Much later in the evening, the scene shifted to an underground structure within the city. A group of men stood quietly beside a parked car. Inside the vehicle, one of the occupants turned to the man sitting beside him, asking if it was truly right for them to step into this situation just to watch a single kid. The man, by his right, simply asked him to leave it. He explained that they shouldn't possess that kind of mindset, asserting that even if they had become vampires, they were still required to remain completely loyal to their senior. The man sitting beside him grew a bit impatient with the lecture, reminding his companion about the events of the previous year. He recalled how their men had been completely sliced up while entertaining the Jeokyo clan, forcing them to take the fall for the disaster simply because they were all vampires. He grumbled that now they were being deployed just to catch some random brats. The stillness of the underground garage was suddenly shattered. The passenger reacted instantly, grabbing the driver by the shoulder to pull him out of harm's way, just as a heavy fire extinguisher smashed violently through the glass window. The passenger managed to block the brunt of the flying debris. However, the force of the impact caused a loud, concussive echoing inside the vehicle, filling the immediate area with thick smoke and shattered glass. When the smoke finally cleared from the air, the two vampires stepped out of the damaged vehicle. They looked around the concrete floor to find that Han had already systematically taken down every single one of the gang members who had been waiting outside the car. The two vampires walked forward, observing the unconscious bodies. One of them remarked that Han had already taken care of all their guys outside, noting that while the subordinates hadn't been vampires for very long, they were still considered valuable combat assets. They stopped a few paces away, glaring at the youth. One of the vampires asked Han if he had enjoyed having his fun, calling him a little brat. He then stated that they had a bit of a problem, explaining that they didn't think they could actually give him the specific goods he had asked for. Han looked back at them, a calm smile spreading across his face. He stated that he hadn't actually expected them to bring the weapons. The vampire paused, looking surprised as he glared at Han's relaxed demeanor. Han met his gaze, asking what else he could possibly expect from a bunch of common thugs. Han shifted his stance. He looked the two vampires dead in the eye, stating that if he ripped out their fangs, he could probably sell them for a decent price. The training space inside the gym was chaotic, as Han and Song Deokyeon engaged in a heavy, continuous spar. Song Deokyeon moved with deliberate precision, while he explained that the specific entity responsible for taking Han's family was highly likely to be connected directly to the Sungdong gang. Han tracked his mentor's movements closely, inquiring naturally if he was implying that a creature of the night was actively conspiring with common street gangsters. The spar continued at full force. Song Deokyeon relied on his seasoned instincts, smoothly dodging the majority of the youth's calculated attacks. Though Han was equally as graceful, instantly counterattacking with a sharp punch aimed directly at Song Deokyeon's side. The successful connection caught Song Deokyeon by surprise. Shifting his balance to reset the flow of the session, Song Deokyeon asked Han if he happened to know the true reason why Sylvester was widely nicknamed the True Vampire Hunter. Han adjusted his grip, asking why his mentor was bringing up that piece of history so suddenly. Song Deokyeon explained that the title was earned because Sylvester had personally taken the life of the true vampire, Deokyo. Han struck his hands together, stepping back into the rhythm of the exchange, while noting that the explanation regarding the entity named Deokyo felt a bit too brief. Song Deokyeon kept his movements steady as they traded blows, explaining that true vampires are inherently powerful entities possessing a vampire translate potency value well over several 100,000. He noted that their physical regeneration capabilities outpaced the damage caused by natural sunlight, a trait that allowed them to remain completely active even during the day. Among those entities, the Jeokyo clan, which was led directly by Deokyo, was a faction that had achieved significant notoriety. Han gathered from the explanation that this was a group driven by a desire to conquer the territory, a factor that made their presence a substantial threat to the stability of the area. The force of the training session shifted abruptly as Song Deokyeon executed a powerful maneuver, delivering a strike that propelled Han straight across the mat towards the net cage behind him. Falling directly to the ground, Song Deokyeon stood over him, continuing his explanation by stating that after Deokyo was killed by Sylvester, the entire clan instantly fell from grace. Han looked up from the canvas, reasoning that the remaining remnants of the Jeokyo clan must have aligned themselves with the Sangdong gang. Song Deokyeon extended his hand to help Han up from the floor, confirming the deduction and explaining that the survivors were actively trying to find traces of Deokyo's legacy. Han stood up with his mentor's assistance, questioning what specific traces they could possibly be looking for. Song Deokyeon kept his grip firm, explaining that the remnants were desperate to inherit Deokyo's former power and regain their past status in the underground hierarchy. Suddenly, before Han could process the statement, Song Deokyeon gripped the youth firmly by his shirt and threw him across the room, sending him crashing straight to the ground once more. Song Deokyeon warned him that even if the reputation of the Jeokyo clan was diminished, the squire, the clan's dangerous second-in-command and successor, remained completely alive. He commanded Han not to act recklessly, stating firmly that if he ever became their target, every single moment of his existence would become absolute hell. The heavy atmosphere of the memory dissolved, returning fully to the present darkness of the underground garage. One of the vampires launched himself forward, initiating a rapid assault. Han reacted instantly, utilizing his bike to swerve around the incoming trajectory, smoothly dodging the first attack. The second vampire called out to his companion, asking if he required any assistance with the target. The attacking vampire screamed back in anger, stating that he would handle this matter entirely by himself and telling his partner to stay exactly where he was. His mate was calm, asking if that statement was meant to be an official order, but the attacker reiterated, glaring back while requesting that he simply stay put. During that brief second of internal distraction, Han seized the opening, launching a swift counterattack aimed directly at the man's neck. The vampire's reflexes were sharp enough to intervene, using his hand to deflect the incoming blade before it could strike a fatal blow. Han immediately turned the bike around, resetting his balance to execute a second pass at his opponent. As the vehicle moved forward, the vampire turned an annoyed gaze toward Han, muttering that he was relying on the exact same pattern and asking if the youth took him for a complete fool. The entity launched himself straight at Han, swinging his arm with tremendous physical force. Han managed to steer the bike to avoid the brunt of the swing, positioned to strike the man from behind. In that split second, Han completely abandoned the vehicle while he jumped cleanly to the ground. The vampire tracked the movement, shouting that he had predicted the entire maneuver. He swung his hand across the trajectory, his claws slicing sharply into Han's shoulder. Han remained completely steady, despite the injury. He gripped his sword firmly and swung it downwards in a heavy arc. However, a metallic snap echoed through the quiet space as the blade cut short upon impact. Han recognized the failure of the weapon, just as the vampire broke into a loud laugh, looking down at Han and mocking him by asking if that little exchange had been fun. Suddenly, Han swung the broken hilt backwards with a sudden, precise upward trajectory, and the vampire collapsed limply onto the concrete floor. The other vamp rose, staring at the body in absolute shock. He looked down at his fallen partner, dryly noting that he had explicitly told him to stay put. Han let out a calm laugh, looking down at the defeated opponent and remarking that the situation was turning out great. He stepped over the fallen vampire, mentioning that he had invested a whopping 5 million won into their organization, making it absolutely necessary to harvest this much value to make the transaction worth his time. He steadied his hands, preparing his stance. A unique mechanical apparatus was embedded directly into the structure of his glove, featuring a small, functional barrel. The surviving vampire glared at Han with deep suspicion, as Han added that doing at least this much was only fair. What followed was a swift, heavy punch directed straight at the downed vampire's face. The physical strike was accompanied by a loud, concussive gunshot from the glove mechanism, the point-blank force destroying the target's face in an instant. The vampire by the car watched the entire execution, thoroughly stunned by the sudden deployment of the specialized gear. Han smiled quietly. Having successfully subdued his first opponent, he turned his attention toward the remaining man. The vampire let out a low whistle, asking what was up with that strange glove, and questioning if an item like that could even be considered a product of the 21st century. He began to laugh, walking slowly up to Han while observing that the youth had clearly expected them to show up from the very beginning. Han didn't flinch, firmly picking the blade up. He turned to face the advancing threat, stating simply that the only business he cared about was his head, telling the vampire to cut the crap and hurry up and come at him if he understood the situation. The vampire laughed loudly at the bravado, calling it a fresh reaction, and asking if the kid was a total psycho. He claimed that he had already completely finished scanning Han's combat style. Han ignored the taunt, throwing his sword at the vampire. The vampire tracked the movement easily, shouting that the sword was already broken, and that he had completely figured out the trick behind the glove. The vampire swung his arm with immense strength, swatting the sword away, though the man grew annoyed, stating that he was going all out now. Suddenly, the vampire's words caught in his throat. He looked down to see that Han had already shifted his stance, holding a hidden firearm pointed directly at his chest, just as Han pulled the trigger. A loud explosion echoed through the underground garage as the projectile tore through the target, sending blood spatters across the immediate area. The fluid began to drip down the vampire's face as he stumbled backward, muttering in disbelief, asking when Han had even managed to pull out a gun. The strength left his limbs, and he fell backward, his body dropping completely limp onto the cold ground. Han knelt quietly in the stillness of the room, staring sternly at the lifeless body in front of him. He reminded the quiet space that he'd already told the man that he'd be going for his head. After the heavy clash in the underground garage subsided, Han moved deliberately, pulling out a syringe to draw the dark blood from the corpse of the fallen vampire. As he worked, a sharp ache flared in his upper body. He used a portion of the harvested blood on himself to stimulate the healing process for the injury on his hand. The moment the dark fluid entered his system, a wave of intense physical agony washed over him. Han screamed inwardly from the sheer pain, He cried out loudly against the stillness of the room. Han remained knelt there on the ground for a considerable time. Much later, he mounted his bike and rode out of the basement. When he reached the upper level, he recognized that Song Deokyeon was already standing there in the cool night air, waiting for him. Song Deokyeon looked at him steadily, asking why he was only coming out just now, and inquiring if he felt any better after his little rampage. Han kept his posture guarded, asking how his mentor had even known he was down there. Song Deokyeon dismissed the question lightly, mentioning that there was a useful thing called GPS in this modern world. He then gestured toward the vehicle, observing that unlike before, it seemed Han was riding the motorcycle exceptionally rough these days, recalling how he used to treat the machine like a sacred treasure. Han stared down at the motorcycle, a trace of annoyance settling over his features. Without offering an explanation, he hopped onto the bike, stating flatly that it was none of his mentor's business, before revving the engine and riding off into the dark, leaving Song Deokyeon standing alone. As the sound of the engine faded, Song Deokyeon exhaled slowly, his expression growing heavy with deep worry for the boy's future. Meanwhile, across the city, the atmosphere inside the headquarters of the Sangdong gang was incredibly tense. Cheon Young, who stood trembling as he faced his superior. The boss of the organization had already beaten one of his subordinates to the floor in a fit of rage. Turning to glare at the men gathered around the room, he barked at them in annoyance, asking what a bunch of idiots like them could possibly know. Furious that anyone could have failed to predict the punk would turn out to be a trained vampire hunter, the angry man walked over to his chair and sat down heavily, addressing the entire room to state that this whole situation had become a massive headache. He explained that he had willingly turned a blind eye in the past when those rogue vampire hunters quietly snatched one or two of their guys from the fringes, but this blatant incident had made their entire Sangdong gang look completely ridiculous. This commanding figure was Cheon Young-hoo's ultimate boss, Jeong Sang-dong. Cheon Young-hoo stepped forward tentatively, asking if they should immediately contact the high-ranking Jeokyo clan to handle the problem. Jeong Sang-dong snapped instantly, screaming at the top of his lungs and asking if Cheon Young-hoo was actively trying to advertise the fact that his boss was completely screwed, hurling a weapon that struck one of the men behind Young-hoo. The unfortunate man fell limp to the ground as blood spilled everywhere across the floorboards. Jeong Sang-dong ignored the collateral damage. He demanded confirmation, recalling that they had described the perpetrator as a mere minor riding a motorcycle. Cheon Young-hoo bowed his head, admitting that, while they weren't entirely certain of the details, that description was indeed correct. Jeong Sang-dong grabbed his jacket and stood up, beginning to walk out of the room, stating that he didn't care if they had to spread pocket money to every street kid in the city to get eyes on the target. They simply had to find him and kill him no matter what. Jeong Sang-dong stopped and glared back over his shoulder, asking the underboss if he was completely lacking in understanding. He clarified the instruction perfectly, telling him to make absolutely sure they sliced the youth's throat. Later that evening, the scene shifted to a quieter part of the city. Song Deokyeon was walking out of a neighborhood supermarket carrying a plastic bag. At the corner of the building, Han sat quietly on the bench, enveloped by the stillness of the night. Song Deokyeon tossed a bottle of an energy drink toward the youth. Han cracked open the beverage, breaking the silence by reminding his mentor about his own past words, noting that Song Deokyeon had told him the Sangdong gang was directly connected to the remnants of the Deokyo clan. Han turned to him, questioning why they simply left the criminal organization alone under those circumstances, asking point-blank if the veteran hunter was actually scared of street gangsters. Song Deokyeon remained silent, prompting Han to press further, demanding to know what the real reason was if fear wasn't the issue. Song Deokyeon replied calmly, stating that the reality was simple. There was absolutely no money to be made in pursuing them, noting that Han should already know how the business operated. The practical response caused a spark of pure annoyance in Han. He raised his voice, arguing passionately that those monsters thoroughly deserved to die regardless of whether the hunt was profitable or not. He asked his mentor if letting vampires live wasn't equivalent to allowing a spreading plague to consume the populace. He continued his reasoning, asserting that nipping a threat in the bud was inherently easier than trying to chop down a giant tree later on. He looked at the older man, asking bitterly if Song Deokyeon spoke this way simply because he had never personally lost anything precious to him in his entire life. The emotional accusation struck a nerve. Song Deokyeon's expression darkened considerably as he slammed his beverage can onto the table surface. He glared directly into Han's eyes, asking the youth if he truly believed he was qualified to be the judge who arbitrarily decides who gets to live and who dies in this world. He told Han not to make him laugh, explaining with a heavy, grounded tone that he had never once killed even a single mosquito for the sake of an ideology. He made it entirely clear that he only killed for cold cash and profits. He asked Han directly if he had gone ahead and injected vampire blood into his system. He stated firmly that he was absolutely sure he had warned him before that the blood of lineage vampires was highly prone to causing severe mutations in humans. Han instinctively grabbed his own shoulder, his silence revealing that he knew he had been caught red-handed. Song Deokyan let out a bitter curse, muttering that he never should have agreed to the true vampire hunter's deal in the first place, commanding him to pack his bags and get out of his sight today. As the reality of his dismissal settled in, Han felt a wave of disorientation, wondering briefly why the ghost of past figures like Jong-jun always seemed to linger over his choices. But before he could sink deeper into his thoughts, Song Deokyan called out to him one last time. He informed Han that he had already packed a few specialized swords and some protective armor for him. He added that he was leaving him with about 500 rounds of ammunition, though he dryly noted the boy would probably die before he ever managed to use them all, telling him to be careful. He mentioned that the firearms were Hungarian-made and had long since passed their official shelf life, joking grimly that if Han was lucky, the guns might just explode in his hands. Recognizing the deep, unspoken care hidden beneath the harsh farewell, Han stood up and bowed very respectfully towards Song Deokyan, thanking him sincerely for everything he had done for him. Song Deokyan glared at him for a quiet moment, the image of Han's very beginning flashing through his mind. He tapped the boy on the shoulder as he began to walk away, delivering a stern, final piece of advice. Don't ever become something like a vampire. He warned Han that if that tragedy ever occurred, he would personally hunt him down without an ounce of mercy, promising that he wouldn't go easy on him just because he was the one who had raised him. Han stood perfectly still in the heavy silence of the night. He mounted his motorcycle and kicked it into gear, pulling out into the empty streets. As the wind brushed past his face, a single trickle of tears came down from his eyes. He recognized internally that the full moon hanging above the city that night was beautiful enough to make a person cry. Much later, in an entirely different part of town, the environment shifted to a desolate lot, where a group of local gang members were huddled closely around a makeshift fire, burning inside a metal can to keep themselves warm. Their quiet murmuring was interrupted as Cheon-young, who stepped into the light of the flames, introducing himself clearly as Cheon-young-hoo of the Sangdong Credit Loans Organization. One of the rival gang members looked up from the fire, completely unimpressed, asking what that was supposed to mean to them. Cheon-young, who kept his posture straight, explaining that he had no intention of making this encounter long. He looked around the circle, demanding to know who their leader was because he needed to speak with him directly. The leader of the group stood up slowly, staring back at the executive. He stated flatly that he didn't believe he had any business to conduct with a guy like him. Cheon-young, who simply stared back, a cold look appearing on his face. Suddenly, his subordinates stepped forward from the darkness. Cheon-young, who sighed, mentioning that he had genuinely tried to handle this matter nicely. Cheon-young, whose men began to alter, their physical forms shifting rapidly as they transformed into two vicious, predatory vampires right before their eyes. The peaceful night environment vanished instantly, making it absolutely clear that a brutal bloodbath was about to unfold. The vampires had subdued the biker leader, pinning him firmly against the dirt near the cooling embers of the campfire. His girlfriend watched with a wary, trembling focus, her eyes fixed on the display of overwhelming strength. Cheon-young, who stepped closer, looking down at the struggling man, and cautioned his vampire subordinates not to twist the leader's limbs too severely, seeing as he was a biker by trade. The leader, feeling the immense weight of the vampire holding him down, finally screamed out his submission, promising to do whatever they asked. Satisfied with the shift in the man's tone, Cheon-young, who glared at his vampire associate and barked an order to bring over the bag. When the vampire hesitated in confusion, Cheon-young, who lost his patience, screaming at the punk to retrieve the money bag hidden in the trunk of the car. Cheon-young, who walked up to the man, presenting him with a significant advance in cash. He mentioned that the leader could use the funds to tempt his crew with new bikes or simply gorge themselves on meat. Either way, the goal was the same. He commanded them to find the green-haired high school brat and bring him in. He offered a final warning. One of the vampires suddenly bared his teeth, lunging toward the leader's throat, but Cheon-young, who intervened. He stopped the creature, telling him to calm down and avoid the neck. He smiled at the terrified biker, noting that they couldn't have him dying before the task even started. The leader was left in a state of utter disorientation, his mind clouded by the sudden eruption of violence in his face. The vampire struck the leader's hand with a heavy blow, a calculated move to ensure the seriousness of the situation was felt physically. Cheon-young, observing that as night fell, Those who were already foolish seemed to grow even stupider. He pondered quietly how convenient it would be if garlic or crosses truly offered a way to control such creatures. Much later, the scene shifted to the Ayuna Cafe. As the door swung open, Ayuna turned with a professional smile to announce they were closed, but her words were cut short when she recognized the visitor. Her face lit up with excitement as she realized it was Han. He walked in looking remarkably gracious in his current attire, his presence filling the quiet room. He noted that it had been 4 months since they last spoke. Ayuna marveled at his transformation, commenting on how he had grown into a handsome man. Han responded with a blunt honesty, stating that he had taken growth hormone injections. Ayuna asked how he found his new independence, but Han sensed the underlying knowledge in her voice. He realized she was already aware of his situation. She explained that Song Deok-yeon had raised him based on a specific request, and since she served as Sylvester's representative in Korea, she received regular reports on his progress. She then turned more serious, deducing that he hadn't come just for a social visit. Han confirmed her suspicion, mentioning that he had heard of a tool used to detect vampires known as a bloodstone pendulum. Ayuna brought the device out and placed it on the table between them. She cautioned him that finding vampires would not be an easy task. While the tool was effective, its maximum detection range was limited to a mere 20 meters. Han reached for it immediately, stating his intention to buy it, but Ayuna advised him to spend his limited funds more wisely. She suggested a crossbow equipped with silver-tipped bolts as an alternative. Han mentioned that he already possessed a few weapons, though he admitted he lacked a weapon in the true specialized sense of the word. Ayuna reasoned that Old Man Ju was likely reluctant to sell Han any psychedelic moon because he was still a minor. She remarked that while Old Man Ju was the only reliable dealer, his strict adherence to principle made him difficult to negotiate with. Remembering something, she reached under her cabinet and produced a small supply with a VT of 13. She presented it to Han as a secret between the two of them. Our boy looked at the offering in genuine shock, reaching out to accept it with a silent thanks. But Ayuna pulled it back with a playful smile. She reminded him that her establishment did not accept cards, stretching out her hand in expectation of cash. Later, in the quiet of a different space, Han rested against a crowbar, staring out at the horizon. He felt the weight of his past memories. He remembered the cold welcome to the world of the Mad Moon. He realized with a start that a full year had already passed, and he wondered if Sylvester would ever actually return to Korea. His thoughts were interrupted by a familiar, unwelcome voice. It was the red-haired leader from his old gang, Jeong Yong-jin. The man walked up to Han, expressing his surprise at finally finding him after such a long search. He noted that Han had changed so much in the last year, he almost didn't recognize him. Jeong Yong-jin's girlfriend grabbed Han's side, commenting on his height and asking if he remembered her. Han looked visibly uncomfortable, asking who she was. This prompted a laugh from Jeong Yong-jin, who noted that Han's rude way of speaking remained unchanged. He stepped closer, calling Han a brat who was still wet behind the ears. He admitted that the more he thought about their history, the angrier he became, cursing Han for the trouble he had caused. Han glared at him sternly, asking if he wanted to die. As the tension rose, the bloodstone pendulum beneath Han's clothes suddenly began to beep. He felt a wave of internal disorientation. The sun was still up, which usually meant vampires were inactive. He reasoned that only a true vampire, a ruler of the night, could move with such strength in the daylight. He looked at Jeong Yong-jin's jacket and deduced that the man had been beaten by a vampire. While a beating didn't guarantee mutation, the reaction of his pendulum suggested the man was already in the process of turning. Han spoke the name of the Sangdong gang aloud. Jeong Yong-jin realized he had been found out and dropped his act. He revealed that the gang was offering 2 million won for his location, and 8 million if they brought him in. He stated firmly that his crew had no intention of settling for the smaller amount. Han felt a sharp impulse to kill them then and there, but he recognized there were too many witnesses nearby. Instead, he mocked them, asking if 8 million was really considered a lot when split among such a large crowd of beggars. Infuriated, Jeong Yong-jin grabbed Han by the shirt, pulling back a fist to strike him. Han remained calm, suggesting that if Jeong Yong-jin wanted to keep his pride as a biker, they should settle their dispute like bikers rather than thugs. Jeong Yong-jin composed himself and agreed to the challenge. Later, the two stood on a stretch of open road, readying their machines for a race. A man stepped between them to announce the rules of the cannonball run. The finish line was set at the entrance to the Gyeongjin Expressway. Jeong Yong-jin looked over at Han, noting that it had been a while since they rode together. He mentioned that if Han had been more agreeable, They might have even shared a beer. Han remained silent for a moment before telling the man to take a good look at the sunset, as it would be the last sight he ever saw. Jung Yong-jin dismissed the threat as nonsense. The starter raised his hand and then swung it downward, his hand striking the ground to commemorate the commencement of the race. The engines roared into life instantly, and Han and Jung Yong-jin surged forward. They sped off on their bikes as the race began. The group trailed them at high speeds, the weight of the wind pressing against their frames as they tore through the asphalt. Jung Yong-jin's confidence wavered for a moment as a massive truck appeared in his path, a looming wall of steel that dominated the road. With practiced, fluid motions, both riders swerved around the vehicle to avoid its sheer size. Jung Yong-jin screamed at Han over the gale, mocking him by asking if he had even touched a bike in the past year. He taunted the youth, claiming he had grown slow and was completely washed up. Han paid the insults no mind, remaining focused on the road. He knew that even if the transformation within Jung Yong-jin was progressing, the man was still technically human. Han's thoughts drifted back. His mentor had reasoned that if the premise of a situation made killing necessary, there was nothing else to consider. Han realized that he was currently standing in that very gap of uncertainty. Suddenly, Han veered off the regular route, steering his machine away from the designated path. Jung Yong-jin screamed in confusion, demanding to know where he was going. He followed anyway, his annoyance growing as his crew trailed behind, baffled by the sudden change in direction. Nearby, Cheon Young, who received a call while heading toward a different location. He demanded an update, asking if the crew was currently chasing the target. The voice on the other end clarified that it wasn't exactly a chase, but more of a race, a battle between men. Cheon Young-hoo was visibly annoyed by the phrasing, screaming that the man was acting far too carefully and asking what kind of battle could possibly justify losing track of the boy. He warned them that the target was beyond their imagination. Despite his frustration, he informed them he was heading there immediately, commanding them to hold Han in place. When the crew admitted they had lost sight of him, Cheon Young-hoo's disorientation turned into pure rage. The scene shifted to a secluded construction site. Han pulled into the dusty space, followed closely by Jung Yong-jin. The biker leader began to scream, calling Han a coward for turning tail and running away in the middle of a race. He claimed Han had lost his nerve in just 1 year. Han glared at him with a heavy, cold expression, asking the man why he hadn't simply admitted he wouldn't go through with it. Jung Yong-jin was bewildered by the question, but before he could respond, Han pulled out his firearm and fired. The projectile pierced Jung Yong-jin straight in the throat. Blood spatters painted the dusty ground as the man grabbed his neck, falling limp from his bike and onto the dirt. Han walked up to the dying man. He pulled out a bag of blood, telling Jung Yong-jin that he might actually live if he drank it. As the fluid entered his system, Jung Yong-jin felt a strange, terrifying shift. He recognized that the pain was vanishing, replaced by an overflowing sense of power. His fangs tore through his gums, and his eyes bulged a deep, predatory red. Driven by a newfound hunger, he lunged to attack Han. In that exact moment, Han struck him squarely in the chest with a specialized attack. The impact caused the man to start burning from the inside out, the heat radiating from his core. Jung Yong-jin screamed viciously as his body began to incinerate. He reached out toward Han one last time, cursing him as a son of a bitch and demanding to know what had been done to him. Han stood over him, emotionless and steady, watching as the man's life turned to ash. Our boy was making the hard calls today. Much later, Cheon Young-hoo arrived at the site to find the remaining biker crew looking confused and unable to provide a coherent report. He glared at them in annoyance as they pointed toward the area where Han and Jung Yong-jin had disappeared. When they arrived at the center of the construction site, they found only the charred remains of the biker leader. The transformation into a monster had already progressed too far. Jung Yong-jin was a life that would have eventually become a plague upon the world. Han rode off into the night, his mind anchored to Song Deokyeon's words about the necessity of killing. He justified the choice as an unavoidable one, a sacrifice for the greater good. Though they might have been close enough to share a beer in another life, that reality no longer existed. As he rode, tears trickled through his eyes, a silent testament to the heavy warmth of a past that was now truly gone. The scene transitioned to the bustling heart of the city, where people were returning home after a long day of labor. Inside an upscale shop, a clerk was nervously trying to assist a man who sat with his legs folded graciously. The man spoke in a calm, melodic tone, telling her it was fine to speak Korean, as he understood it perfectly. Relieved, she asked what he would like to order, and the man requested champagne. His quiet moment was interrupted when a young, blond boy ran into the shop, calling out to him as "Master." The man turned his attention to the newcomer, asking what the matter was. The boy, Wilhelm, explained that a girl had suddenly collapsed right in front of their car. He pointed toward the street, waiting for his master's instructions. The master stepped outside and glared at the lady slumped on the pavement. After a moment of observation, they placed her into the car. As they drove toward their destination, Wilhelm turned from the front seat to look at the girl, asking his master if he was truly all right with this. He suggested that leaving the stranger to the police might be more rational. The master laughed softly, explaining to Wilhelm that there is a certain fate in everything in this world, a value he cherished deeply, noting that fate is not always rational. As he smiled, he revealed sharp fangs and glowing blue eyes, confirming his nature as the true vampire known as Phantom. He alone knew the true purpose he had for the girl he had just claimed. The moment they finally arrived at the very tall building, the scene shifted inside, where Phantom stood quietly before a massive mirror. A glass rested in his hand, filled with a dark liquid that looked like wine beneath the dim lighting. Behind him, Wilhelm called out to him as master, just like usual, and mentioned that, as ordered, he had returned her to Yonsei Medical Center. Phantom responded calmly and said that Wilhelm had done well, adding that he'd visit her sometime. Wilhelm questioned why Phantom cared so much about that Asian girl. Phantom answered by reminding him that he had already said he was a romanticist. At those words, Wilhelm let out a tired sigh and remarked that there was no such thing as a romanticist. In his eyes, Phantom was simply running away from work. Wilhelm then sat down in the chair nearby and immediately began working on his computer. He told Phantom that if he truly wanted to find romance, then he should finish his own work first. After that, he could go buy flowers, or do whatever he wanted. Phantom paused at the mention of flowers. He actually seemed to consider the idea for a moment, before asking Wilhelm if he had looked into it. Wilhelm answered that he had, and that it had recently appeared on the news. He explained that her name was Yoon Mi-hye, and that reports claimed she had been abused by her classmates. Phantom immediately concluded that she was no ordinary woman. Soon after, Phantom lowered himself onto the sofa while his phone floated in front of him. Wilhelm continued reading the article aloud. The report mentioned that 6 students, including Miss M from a girls' high school, had been booked without detention. According to the article, they claimed she was usually disobedient and arrogant. It was also stated that they had encouraged local men to assault her multiple times. Phantom listened quietly before commenting that it was the kind of article cold enough to make the victim's blood boil. A few moments later, Wilhelm informed him that a video from Sylvester had just arrived and asked whether he wanted to watch it. Phantom responded that Sylvester was still poking his nose into everything. He slowly rose from the sofa and mentioned that he had heard Sylvester even went overseas looking for him. That alone made it obvious how much the man despised him. Phantom admitted that he had hoped to enjoy his visit to South Korea after being away for so long. Wilhelm then added that Sylvester had not only gotten him excommunicated from the Vatican, but had also frozen all of his accounts. Phantom acknowledged that it was true. Phantom smiled and agreed to do some research for himself. Wilhelm played the video and a man was lying against the fence outside what looked like a pub, blood scattered around him in thick stains across the pavement. The lighting overhead flickered faintly. Standing in front of him was Sylvester, slowly stepping into the light with those blue glowing eyes fixed on the trembling figure before him. The camera captured everything carefully. Back in the room, Phantom continued his explanation to Wilhelm, quietly reciting ashes to ashes and dust to dust. Meanwhile, the man on the ground pleaded desperately for his life, but Sylvester paid him almost no attention. He questioned whether the man was actually begging to survive. The scene drifted back toward Phantom as he reiterated Sylvester's words. He explained that the man standing there, filled with the blood of others, was now begging for mercy himself. Phantom repeated the question Sylvester had asked. Was he truly claiming to be a living being right now? If that was truly the case, then cry. Cry and prove your purity. Those were the words Sylvester had spoken while pressing his sword lightly against the creature's neck. Phantom then remarked that the creature could not cry. That was its limit. Its only remaining instinct was to beg, because it understood human psychology well enough to imitate fear. And in the very next moment, Sylvester swung his blade. The movement was clean and direct. No wasted motion. The steel sliced across the creature's neck instantly, ending everything before another sound could escape. That was the end for the creature. Phantom, of course, continued explaining the scene with unnecessary drama layered into every sentence, but that was simply how he was. Still, the camera had caught every detail as Sylvester completely laid waste to the creature standing before him. Much later that evening, Wilhelm approached Phantom once more. Phantom quietly commented that Sylvester was still the same as ever. Wilhelm poured wine into a cup, while Phantom remarked that Sylvester never changed. Phantom added that, for someone who called himself a poet, Sylvester was a complete failure. Soon after, the scene shifted again. Inside an old restroom, Han had not been able to eat properly for 2 days. The stale smell inside the cramped space clung heavily to the walls as he leaned over the toilet, spitting repeatedly while trying to steady himself. His face looked pale and exhausted. The memories of his final moments with Jung Yong-jin kept flashing through his mind without pause. It had been an unavoidable choice. Han understood that much, yet the weight of it still sat heavily inside him. He had chosen to honor his friend's life, but the things he had witnessed continued to churn inside his stomach. Han slammed his fist against the toilet seat in frustration. The sharp sound bounced through the restroom. Much later, Han sat alone with food placed in front of him, trying to gather himself together piece by piece. The place around him was busy with people constantly moving somewhere in a hurry. He quietly observed them and wondered where everyone was going with such urgency. What exactly were they all so busy with? Then suddenly, someone approached him. A young woman bent slightly toward him and politely excused herself with a smile. Han shifted his attention toward her. She asked if anyone had ever told him that he looked like Kurt Cobain. Han found himself slightly bewildered by the comment. Plenty of people had asked whether he was interested in women before, but this was the first time someone had approached him like this. Before the conversation could continue, another voice suddenly called out toward her. The name Jin Yumi reached Han's ears as 3 men walked into the area. One of them asked her if she was pretending not to hear him and demanded that she answer properly. Then the man's eyes landed on Han. He immediately asked what kind of punk Han was while glaring at him openly. Han slowly rose from his seat. The moment he stood up fully, the man facing him visibly stiffened for a second. Han did not even acknowledge it. He simply turned around and began walking away without paying any attention to them. That only irritated the man further. He cursed at Han and grabbed him by the shoulder, demanding to know where he thought he was going since he was being spoken to. But before another word could leave his mouth, a single strike landed directly into the man's nose. The impact folded the man's body instantly before he crashed onto the floor in complete shock. Jin Yumi smiled faintly at the sight. She clearly had not realized Han was this strong. Han then looked down at the man and apologized calmly, stating firmly that he thought a bug had landed on him. Holding his nose, he realized that he was bleeding heavily. Han glared at him as he lay on the floor. The man slowly got up, calling Han a bastard, and asked if he had a death wish. Han began to walk away, and the man screamed at him to stop, calling him a bastard, and told him to follow them before he killed him right there. He kept screaming at Han, but Han paid him no mind. Han turned to him and asked if a person like him was really going to kill him. He glared at him maniacally, ready to see it through. The scene then shifted to a different space. Jin Yumi was putting on her earplugs and listening to music on her phone. She smiled while she listened to the music because it felt like home to her. In that same moment, our boy was fighting the entire crew, taking all of them on at once. One of them tried to kick him, but Han grabbed the man by his shoe and twisted his leg instantly. The man screamed as he fell straight to the ground. Another person came in with a punch to attack Han, but Han dodged the attack and swung a punch back toward the guy's face. In an instant, before the attacker even knew what was going on, he fell straight to the ground right in front of Han. Beside the area, Jin Yumi sat and looked at the fight happening in front of her. All the other people around her were scared, but Jin Yumi remained strangely calm. The third person fighting Han brought out a pocket knife, but Han struck him in the gut swiftly, causing the guy to lose his footing straight to the ground. Han struck him once more in the neck, and that kick sent him straight to the floor. There was still another person behind Han trying to launch a sneak attack. While Han was looking at the guy on the floor, this attacker approached his neck and struck him on the shoulder with a weapon, pulling the cut to intensify the damage. The man began to laugh, but as Han turned his back to look at him, he realized the man had only given him a shallow cut on his back. Han glared at the guy, almost as if nothing had happened. The man became terrified as he looked at Han, realizing that his attack did not do the damage he had expected. Han looked very annoyed in that moment, and the man was so scared that he held his weapon up while glaring at Han, looking as if he was about to run away from the fight. He began to swing every which way in fear, looking thoroughly disoriented. Han struck his hand in that exact moment, causing the weapon to fall from his grip as the man shouted. Han grabbed the weapon while it was falling. Han then grabbed the man by his head and raised the hand, holding the weapon with the intention to strike him near his ear. As the man watched Han's hand descend, he was terrified. The weapon struck him on his face, and all he could do was scream while Han delivered the final blows. As the man was about to fall backward, Han used his knees to strike him straight in the face. He continued to strike him in the face multiple times, telling him to try harder. It was a very jarring situation, and the ladies who were watching began to run away as Han continuously kept striking the man. Han was extremely enraged and screamed at the man, asking if he really thought he could kill someone with just that level of skill. Jin Yumi stared at Han, and it was hard to tell if she was astonished or fearful. She just kept looking at Han while listening to her music, her cheeks blushing as she watched him. Han finally paused his movements and turned his attention toward Jin Yumi. He realized there was no one left standing. He exhaled heavily. Jin Yumi looked at him and suddenly started to sweat softly. Han slowly fell to the ground after the intense match he had to endure because he was bleeding heavily from his back and losing a lot of blood. Jin Yumi got up, dusted herself off, and walked up to Han. Everyone else was already lying on the floor, either unconscious or completely lifeless. The next day, the scene cut to a different space inside the cafe. Ayuna was busy cleaning the restaurant and cafe. She stood up, wiped the sweat from her face, and wondered if she needed to hire a part-time worker. She looked outside the window to ponder the idea, and just then, a car arrived. Once the car door opened, Ayuna walked outside and smiled as Sylvester stepped out of the vehicle. She called him Sylvia, as she usually did, but Sylvester immediately told her not to call him that name. She escorted him into her cafe and mentioned that he had returned much earlier than scheduled. But Sylvester simply quoted a line from Dostoevsky to Ayuna and moved on. The moment Han finally woke up from passing out, he found himself in a strange room and slowly rose from the bed. He jolted slightly as his eyes adjusted, quickly realizing that he was in an unfamiliar environment. He began to wonder when exactly he had passed out while observing the space. He looked around and saw some girls in the same room with him. Looking closer, he discerned that the place was a total mess, noticing scattered cotton pads and tissues that had been used on him for first aid. Just then, Jin Yumi woke up beside him and asked if he was awake. Han replied that he was, immediately adding that he was sorry for the intrusion and would be going now. Jin Yumi stopped him, reminding him that he had been stabbed by a weapon, and questioned if he was really okay to leave like that. The naughty girl then moved closer to him, asking if he wanted to do it with her. Her sudden closeness made Han feel a bit uncomfortable. Jin Yumi walked even closer, looking very shy as she asked if he was not going to touch her, mentioning that she was okay with him. Han glared at her in disbelief, instantly rising from the bed to ask if she was crazy or if she had sniffed glue. Hearing his blunt response, Jin Yumi began to blush deeply. Han's expression softened into pity as he looked at her. He explained that he hadn't eaten anything for a few days, which had left him on edge, and apologized for beating up her boyfriends. Jin Yumi quickly responded, asking to go with him. The scene then cut to a nearby restaurant, where our boy and Jin Yumi were sitting inside eating ramen and rice cakes. Jin Yumi was quietly enjoying the rice cakes with her meal. Han glared at her, analyzing the situation, and noted to himself that she certainly ate well on his dime. Jin Yumi broke the silence, explaining that those guys from earlier were not her boyfriends. She further explained that she had only followed Han out here because she was worried about getting lost. Her reasoning was a bit confusing, prompting Han to ask her if he looked like a kid. He then turned his gaze outside the window, falling into deep thought. Jin Yumi also sat in silence, lost in her own reflections. Han glared at her sideways, intuitively gathering that she might be dealing with the same kind of isolation he was experiencing, though he decided not to pry or ask any questions. Before he could continue his meal, she called out to him. Smiling heavily, she formally introduced herself as Jin Yumi. Han offered a small smile in return, opening his food to continue eating his ramen, while he simply responded to her that he didn't ask. The scene then cut to a completely different space inside a massive building. The quiet hallways were disrupted by the sound of men screaming. One person in particular shouted, demanding to know what kind of hospital management allowed a vulnerable individual to simply escape. The hospital practitioners desperately tried to pacify him, asking him to please calm down. Nearby, a young lady stood silently right beside room 207, watching the commotion. One of the doctors continued trying to soothe the angry man. The man only grew angrier. He screamed that his daughter had almost died on the streets, so expecting him to calm down was absurd. While the man was screaming, Phantom walked directly into the space holding a bouquet of flowers. He observed the chaos and lightly remarked that it seemed he had arrived at a bad time. The shouting man turned his rage toward the newcomer, demanding to know who the hell he was. Phantom did not answer with words. Instead, he simply snapped his fingers and asked to be excused for a moment. The moment his fingers snapped, a strange wave of disorientation washed over the room. The angry man suddenly paused mid-sentence, his rage instantly replaced by a strange sense of euphoria inside his mind. The lady in the background looked on in pure surprise as she glared at Phantom. Phantom ignored the frozen bystanders and focused on her. Based on the news articles and related data he had reviewed, he knew she had been hospitalized for a whole year. He reflected on how humans were never as strong as they believed themselves to be. Yet he reasoned that if her spirit had truly broken, she never would have bothered to escape the hospital in the first place. He walked up to her, offering a calm apology for his actions the previous day. He admitted he hadn't realized how hard she had struggled to escape, expressing regret for returning her to a place like this. He extended the bouquet of flowers toward her and asked if she would like to come with him. Then, with a slight smile, he clarified that she actually didn't have a choice in the matter, jokingly adding that this was technically a kidnapping. The lady silently glared at the flowers. The scene cut away to the interior of Phantom's red car driving down the road. Phantom was engaged in a phone call, listening to the lady on the other end address him by his alias, Mr. Lou Gibson. Phantom instructed her to prepare women's clothes in all sizes. The lady sounded surprised, asking if he was planning to dress Wilhelm in them. Phantom smiled at the remark, noting that her sense of humor had improved quite a lot. He joked that even if he chose to fire her, she could easily make a living as a stand-up comedian. Phantom broke the silence, adding that as long as Wilhelm didn't resist the idea, it might not actually be a bad look. As he spoke, Phantom turned his attention toward the young lady sitting quietly beside him in the passenger seat. He leaned over slightly toward her shoulder, but the movement was abruptly cut short. A sudden blast shattered the rear window. Multiple heavy impacts slammed directly into Phantom's back. He had intuitively sensed the danger and moved his body to protect her from a sudden barrage of bullets. The scene immediately zoomed out, tracking across the vast distance to the source of the gunfire. Far away, Sylvester stood holding a massive sniper rifle. He lowered the heavy weapon, resting it casually against his shoulder with a sharp smile. He quietly observed the distant car, wondering to himself if his excellent greeting had been felt. They finally arrived at the hotel. Phantom walked inside with the young lady, where the guards stood waiting for him. One of the guards welcomed him back as Lord Lou Gibson and mentioned that everything had been prepared according to his instructions. Phantom stopped him and praised his good work. He added that he would have the female bodyguards change her clothes, noting that she could not keep wearing the hospital gown forever. Phantom gave the instruction to the women beside him, who affirmed the command and took the lady away to change her clothes. As they walked off, Phantom dropped the bullets that had been stuck in his back into the guard's hand. He explained that an individual had fired 6 shots in the blink of an eye, all aimed precisely at the young lady, which he found strange. He noted that it was fortunate they were only ordinary bullets. The guard was visibly shocked as he glared at Phantom walking away. Realizing the danger, Phantom simply smiled, adding that if they had been silver bullets, the young lady would have turned into a vampire just from the particles of spewed blood, meaning she was very lucky. He then lightly observed that Sylvester had become quite the gentleman. The scene then cut to a different space, bringing a motorcycle into view. Hans sat down near the bike, completely lost in deep thought. He analyzed the condition of the machine, realizing it was at its absolute limits, and concluding it was a miracle the engine had even started until now. After all the chaos he had recently gone through, expecting it to be fine would be very greedy. He felt quite uncomfortable in that moment, because he had to figure out a different option for his movement. He wanted to get it repaired immediately or sell it to buy a new one, but his wallet couldn't even cho-chang. With no money available, he began to wonder why that old geezer refused to trade with him, reasoning that he would not stop fighting vampires just because the old man acted that way. He knew he needed to sell his vampire blood soon anyway. He deduced that he would have to find another dealer who trades with minors, though he felt a bit baffled about how to find one. Just then, Jin Yumi walked up to him and called him Kurt Cobain. Han was momentarily shocked by her sudden appearance. She sat down right beside him, mentioning that her legs were numb, and asked where he was going now. Han glared at her, feeling slightly bewildered. He noted that she spoke as if they had already been traveling somewhere together. He told her that it was late, and that she should go get some sleep. As he climbed onto his bike to ride off, she asked where he lived. Han told her not to ask him that, changing the subject to ask where her friends were instead. Jin Yumi explained that they had all gone to meet their boyfriends, while some had simply gone home. Han told her that she should go home as well, asking if her parents wouldn't be worried about her being out this late, or if she was currently running away from home. Jin Yumi looked a bit sad as she revealed the truth, stating that she did not have any parents because she was an orphan. Han glared at her in that moment, taken aback by her words. He told her to hop onto the back and promised to take her. She climbed onto the motorcycle, and they went riding out onto the streets together. As they rode, Jin Yumi rested her head against Han's back. Han began to reflect on the lives of delinquent girls, remembering how rough their circumstances usually had to be just to survive. He understood that most of them came from broken families where an authoritarian and oppressive father was the standard experience. He realized this was likely the exact situation Jin Yumi had faced. It was a clear rebellion against being treated like a possession. A traumatic experience of losing everything while still fighting back with no one else to rely on. For people in that position, the fulfillment of such a twisted wish, like losing the cause of your pain, often became something much more dire once it actually happened. Since then, she had essentially given herself over to the madness, experiencing a repetition of days spent destroying herself. Han knew he could not offer her real comfort or support. He couldn't live her life for her, nor could he take responsibility for her future. Yet, while she seemed to be feeling very free during the ride, Han continued to think about her situation. Even though her story was completely all over the place, after hearing it 3 or 4 times, he had easily pieced it together himself. He wondered if it was so easy to understand, simply because she was similar to him. Then, he suddenly remembered how she had asked him to sleep with her on the very first night he was injured. The memory made him a bit angry, and he concluded that she was just a crazy girl. He suddenly started riding very fast, which completely surprised Jin Yumi. She tightly grabbed onto his shirt as our boy sped off through the dark streets. Much later, Han finally stopped his motorcycle at a particular location. He told her that they had arrived and that she could go inside. Jin Yumi asked where he was going now, to which Han replied that he had to leave too because he was going home. The moment he was about to ride off, Jin Yumi called out to him, asking when she could see him again. Han told her that if she was okay with a convenience store, they could eat breakfast together there again. With that stated, he rode off immediately, leaving her at that spot. During the journey back to his own place, Han grew increasingly annoyed from the drag sounds that came from the bike's engine, cursing the motorcycle in his thoughts. He reasoned that if he kept riding the machine just because it was a keepsake, he would end up dead himself. He exhaled heavily, telling himself that he absolutely needed to find a way to make money somehow. Suddenly, he noticed something within his immediate surroundings. He slowed down and parked as he spotted a familiar car resting in front of his destination. He recognized the vehicle outside as Sylvester's car. Once he opened the door and looked inside the coffee shop, he was completely shocked to see Sylvester sitting right inside the area where Ayuna was. Inside the Ayuna Cafe, Han walked directly up to Sylvester and asked him when exactly he had arrived in Korea. Sylvester calmly replied that he had come back not long ago. Han was momentarily taken aback as he reached out and grabbed the file that Sylvester handed over to him. Observing the heavy folder, Han remarked that he guessed Sylvester took random requests like this too, questioning what kind of documents these were. As Han focused his attention on the papers and looked through the detailed contents of the document, a wave of intense frustration hit him. He slammed the document down onto the table and let out a sharp curse. Sylvester glared right back at him, coolly observing that Han had forgotten a lot about his position in the short time since they had last seen each other. Sylvester then looked closely at him and added that maybe Han had simply decided that he wanted to die. Han tried his best to calm himself, though the anger was fully visible across his face. Sylvester watched his reaction and asked if the target was someone he already knew. Han's hand slowly folded tightly into a fist. Looking down at the revealed file, it showed that Jin Yumi was the focus of the investigation. The scene then cut to a completely different location much later. Inside a space controlled by Wilhelm, a meeting was taking place with Jong Songdong. Songdong spoke up, noting that wonders never cease when a brat from Phantasmagoria actually shows up in a place like this. Phantasmagoria was well known as the specific vampire clan, where Phantom ruled as Lord. Sitting across from him was another vampire named Gyeong, who was the leader of the Jeokyo clan. Wilhelm stood calmly in front of the group with a briefcase held firmly in his hand. He looked around the room and remarked that they all looked quite human. "I guess vampires too can make jokes." Gyeong responded immediately to the comment, telling Wilhelm that a puppy that used to strut around safely in its master's arms clearly didn't know its proper place. Wilhelm did not back down, stating that for guys who choose to hang around with mere street gangsters, they should remember that Phantom was not someone they could speak of so lightly. Suddenly, a vampire standing directly behind Gyeong screamed out in anger, cursing loudly. The regular troop member claimed that the only reason they were in this state was because while their former master was busy fighting Chang'un, that cowardly true vampire hunter bastard had interfered in the match. Gyeong quickly silenced the speaker. He turned back to Wilhelm, stating that the conversation had strayed far enough, and told him to simply state his business and get lost. Wilhelm dropped the briefcase heavily onto the ground and used his leg to kick it forward, sliding it closer to the vampires in front of him. Jiang looked down at the case and asked if Wilhelm was seriously telling them to take this small amount and get lost, especially after they had suffered a surprise attack. He reminded Wilhelm that the true vampire hunter was the exact person who killed their master, and concluded that to fight a person of that caliber, this specific amount of money was woefully insufficient. Wilhelm told him not to misunderstand the situation, explaining that this was absolutely not money being given to help them secure their revenge. He noted that their exquisite target was not even present in Korea at the moment. Gyeong grew increasingly uncomfortable upon hearing this, demanding to know why Wilhelm had even bothering coming to see them then. Wilhelm placed his hand calmly into his pocket. He explained that the individual he wanted them to handle was a much weaker guy. With a swift motion, he used his abilities to propel a sheet of paper through the space, sending it flying across the room until it landed flatly in front of them. Gyeong picked up the paper with his hand and read the written contents. The document revealed that Sylvester's disciple Han was the one they were tracking. Wilhelm stated that for a target of this low level, their current group should be more than enough to take care of the job, and questioned the exact location of the guy. Wilhelm responded smoothly, stating that the boy was currently located in Seoul, Gwangwaku. When asked if there was any additional data, Wilhelm remarked that anything more was for them to figure out themselves, noting that they should earn their keep. Gyeong scoffed lightly, calling Wilhelm a terrible client. He then threw the papers across the table toward Jeong Sang-dong, who was sitting directly in front of him. Jeong Sang-dong was taken aback as the pages landed, but Cheong-yong spoke up instantly, calling Han a bastard. Jeong Sang-dong noticed the reaction and asked if he knew the person on the paper. Cheon-young, who confirmed that he did, explaining that the target was the exact high schooler who had caused trouble at the club the last time. Jeong Sang-dong was completely shocked by the realization and began to question him for more details. Wilhelm spoke up amidst the chatter, noting that it seemed like things would be handled very quickly. Jiang smiled sharply, agreeing that they would, concluding that they could finish this job in no time at all and easily earn the money. The scene cut away to the massive, tall building where Phantom resided. Inside the grand space, Phantom stood silently looking out of his massive window. Standing right beside him was the young lady he had taken from the hospital earlier. She broke the silence, observing that he was undeniably rich. Phantom agreed with her assessment completely. She then turned her gaze toward him, asking why someone like him was so interested in her. He thought about the question for a brief second before admitting that it was a difficult one to answer properly. He suggested that they could simply call it the natural sentiment of a bloodkin. The lady looked at him seriously, asking if he was truly going to grant every single thing she wished for. Phantom looked at her and confirmed that if it was possible, he would grant anything she wanted. The lady turned her eyes back toward the outside view, falling into deep thought. She then stated that she wanted to go exactly where those guys were. Phantom was briefly taken aback by her specific request. He looked out the window into the distance, explaining that when a person manages to survive past their given lifespan and continues to maintain that life indefinitely, there is a specific sound they come to hear. He noted that it was one thing the living could never perceive, a clear, vivid voice inciting destruction and death. He turned back to her, stating that it was essentially a chronic disease that comes from living inside this type of body. He smiled lightly, adding that despite the voice, he personally valued patience far more than mere pleasure. The lady turned fully toward him, questioning what he meant by patience. Phantom defined it as the physical strength to endure pain and live through the world, reasoning that if there is something worth protecting through that pain, then even the fires of hell become sweet to endure. He addressed her gently as his little lady. She glared right at him, asking if he truly believed those words to be true. Phantom smiled and said that of course he did, though he had no intention of forcing his personal values onto her. He assured her that as long as she kept living, there would surely be good days ahead. She questioned him further, asking where those good days actually existed. Phantom paused, glaring gently at her before admitting that there were past days when he could almost believe those lies himself, confirming that this harsh reality was real. The lady looked back outside, her eyes looking heavy with exhaustion, as she murmured that it didn't really matter anyway. Phantom observed her silence, recognizing that she possessed the worst trait possible, a complete lack of lingering attachment to life. However, he reasoned to himself that for the child who was about to become the youngest of his kin, gifting revenge wouldn't be a bad thing at all. A sudden, precise movement. Phantom used his hand to slice himself lightly by the neck. As she stood frozen in place, he calmly walked up close to her, placing her head against his neck to drink from him. Right at that exact moment, Wilhelm walked into the grand room to report to his master. He called out to Phantom, starting to explain that the Jeokyo clan had been contacted as instructed. Before he could finish his sentence, he caught sight of exactly what Phantom was doing. The scene took him completely by surprise, leaving him shocked as he screamed out for his master. Phantom simply glared back over his shoulder and smiled calmly. Wilhelm shifted uncomfortably, suddenly feeling a sharp hunger pang in his own stomach from the mere sight of Phantom's powerful blood filling the room. Phantom glared at him with a knowing smile, telling Wilhelm to come over here before he changed his mind so that he could have some of the blood as well. That same night, elsewhere under the heavy rain, Han began to ride through the streets on his motorbike. He looked very annoyed from what had happened earlier. Before this, while Han was speaking with Sylvester, he had thought of the man as a disgusting bastard. During their conversation, Ayuna was quietly washing the cups from the tea they had drank earlier. As they conversed, Sylvester remarked that no matter how long Phantom had been living, his body had rotted to the bone while he simply enjoyed his wealth and power. Sylvester reasoned that for someone like that to talk about saving humans was absurd, noting that it was not as if Phantom was a god. Han asked what a clergyman like himself was supposed to do then to save the world, mentioning that on a certain day the evil spirit of the gods would not spare them, and that their own power would not last forever. Sylvester paused for a second, pointing his two fingers as though he was forming a gun, and calmly said the word, "Bang." Han paused for a second in sheer annoyance. Instantly, he turned around and walked away from Sylvester. Before he could exit, Sylvester called out to him and threw an object through the room. Looking down at his palm, he saw the contents and recognized it was exactly what he had always been asking for. Sylvester turned to him with a final warning, stating that Han was now the target of hatred for the woman the vampire lord had just taken in. He told Han to judge wisely and warned him not to do anything foolish. Han took that warning very sternly as he departed. Back in the present, Han was riding his bike through the pouring rain in a fit of rage, forcing his way forward. In that exact moment, his medallion suddenly began to glow, signaling that a vampire was at a very close range. He looked up and spotted a bat levitating and flying directly atop him. He quickly sensed another bat moving behind him as well. Suddenly, a strange beast resembling a dog surged towards him from the front, an obstacle he had not initially noted. Before he could fully process what was happening, the beast jumped to attack him. The creature glared at him, barking loudly. It was a very strange animal. Our boy quickly swerved his bike, executing a sharp dodge before the beast could cause any damage to him or his motorcycle. Pushing his limits, Han slammed on the brakes to halt his momentum. From the shadows beside him, someone began to clap softly. An elegant-looking lady stepped forward, though her presence confirmed she was a vampire. She remarked that this kid must be the brat Gyung had talked about. Beside Han, the other bat morphed smoothly into a very bulky-looking man who affirmed her statement, staring down at Han. These were the two individuals sent by Gyung to eliminate him. Han remained on his bike, caught in their midst as he glared at the pair, rapidly trying to calculate his next move. The lady behind Han looked at his weapon and asked if that was a real gun, wondering aloud how he had obtained it since possessing a gun in Korea is illegal. Han, wanting to hear no more of their chatter, restarted his bike and accelerated swiftly. He drove forward in an attempt to use the heavy momentum of the bike to crush the lady's head. Before the vehicle could land, she reached out with immense physical weight and grabbed the motorcycle mid-air. The tires struggled and spun loudly, but she stopped the heavy machine instantly with just her bare hand. Thinking quickly to end the encounter, Han pulled out his gun and pointed it directly at her face. The moment he fired the bullets, she swerved her upper body and dodged the impending danger easily. She maintained her tight grip on the motorcycle tire and told Han that he had startled her. With a fierce display of force, she threw the entire motorbike away. The bulky male vampire simply stood by, watching the situation unfold. And Han managed to jump clear of the wreckage while it was still airborne, landing at the other end of the space. Han shifted his head slightly, glaring intensely at the two vampires in front of him. This was going to be a difficult fight. The female vampire slowly wiped her cheek, clearing away the blood that was leaking from a minor bullet wound she had sustained during the exchange. Annoyed by the scratch, she remarked to her companion that the brat was actually pretty good. The male vampire looked at her and stated bluntly that she had just messed up. She screamed back, demanding to know what he meant by that. Han stood firmly in their midst while they bickered, completely unbothered that they were treating him as though he posed no real threat. Han reached into his pocket and pulled out his second gun, mentally reviewing his remaining ammunition. He calculated that he had 3 Tokarev rounds and 5 Type 54 armor-piercing rounds left. He experienced a brief moment of internal realism, understanding that even if he overloaded all of his weapons, winning this encounter through raw firepower was highly unlikely. The vampire lady shrugged the matter off. Suddenly, her body began to morph in a strange, unnatural way as thick tentacles began to flow out of her flesh, flapping fiercely in every direction. The male vampire executed the exact same trick, preparing to launch a coordinated attack against Han. The lady asked if she should replenish the blood she had just spilled. Han watched the heavy attacks swinging directly toward him. Instead of backing away, he instantly dashed forward into their personal space, telling the bastards to move. The two vampires closed the distance in an instant, swinging their mutated limbs violently at Han. Han pulled both of his guns upward simultaneously, fully prepared to take down the both of them at the exact same time. Han began to fire in rapid succession, whilst the vampires graciously dodged mid-air. In that moment, the lady smiled and mentioned that even with silver-threaded bullets, a Tokarev was nowhere near enough. She suddenly extended her tentacles directly towards Han, using them to launch a sharp attack. The tentacles struck the hard ground in multiple places, but Han calculated his movements carefully and was able to dodge the incoming strikes while keeping his eyes fixed on them to pinpoint their exact location. Han dashed away from them, leaving them to land heavily on the exact spot where he had just been standing. However, Han was not fast enough to break away completely. In the blink of an eye, they closed the distance and arrived directly where he stood running, blocking his path and staring him down. The male vampire asked him where exactly he thought he was going. In that moment, Han stopped his running completely and swung his gun towards the man to strike him. As he executed that movement, he suddenly turned and used the gun in his other hand, pointing it directly towards the lady behind him. Before he could pull the trigger, she swung her hand with immense speed and struck the weapon cleanly out of his grip. The vampire displayed high-level combat skill. Without pausing, Han swung his other hand towards the lady to attack, forcing his remaining gun directly against her forehead. Our boy pulled the trigger instantly, and a loud gunshot erupted into the space. But just before he could secure the hit, she had already moved her head to dodge the bullet, and it was revealed that she had used her tentacles to force his aim away. This development left Han thoroughly shocked. He tried to retaliate immediately. However, he was unable to connect because she instantly pulled the tentacles that were securely attached to his hand, launching him through the space. The lady glared down at him, concluding that this guy really had no idea what he was doing. Yet Han remained highly resilient, attempting to pull the tentacles away from his hand while still trying to point his weapon towards them. The lady asked him how long exactly he planned on struggling. She pulled her tentacles once more, attaching them tightly to his other hand. By doing this, she rendered him completely defenseless. In a swift motion, she pulled his frame, swinging him straight to the ground, stating that she had already told him it wouldn't work, leaving him barely able to do anything to retaliate, and he was completely out of options. His eyes closed, and it seemed as though he had fainted. The lady retracted the tentacles back into her fingers, looking down at Han with complete disgust. In that quiet moment, Han's memories began to play. He remembered when he first met her, how she had been annoyed with him, and how she had smiled at him. His memories flashed rapidly before his eyes, showing the entire history of how he had met the young lady. Strangely enough, the recollection was more than enough reason for him to steady his resolve. Han began to push his body up from the ground because he recognized that he wanted to protect her. He slowly tried to move away from his opponents, but the male vampire caught him once more. Using his tentacles, the male vampire grappled Han firmly by the leg to stop his escape. The lady looked down at him, smiling maniacally as she licked her teeth, and asked if she should finally have her meal. Right at that exact moment, a sudden gunshot opened a hole cleanly through the female vampire's head. The attack caught her completely by surprise, and her body fell limp to the ground instantly. The male vampire was left terrified and shocked, wondering how such an attack could even possibly happen. He screamed out loudly, demanding to know who had done this. From a distance, Song Deokyeon appeared, holding his weapon after pulling the trigger. He looked at Han from his hiding spot and called him a bastard, muttering that the boy was trying to fight a vampire without even using Psychedelic Moon. Song Deokyeon was highly annoyed with Han's reckless approach. He called out to Han, asking the crazy bastard if this was truly how he had taught him to fight. The remaining male vampire grew furious. He spotted Song Deokyeon's location and screamed in anger, extending his tentacles rapidly across the space. The moment he was spotted, Song Deokyeon glared back and stepped completely out of his hiding spot. Before Song Deokyeon could get his footing back, the male vampire dashed towards him to launch a counterattack. But the moment the creature got close, Song Deokyeon smoothly pulled out a gun and fired a bullet directly into the man's chest. The shot caused a massive explosion inside the vampire's chest cavity. The man fell heavily to the ground, while Song Deokyeon simply walked away as though it was a perfectly normal Tuesday for him. He had brutalized 2 vampires in a matter of seconds. The male vampire remained on the ground, clutching his wounded chest near the side of the bridge handrail. He looked incredibly annoyed, with a large amount of blood covering his mouth. Suddenly, he threw his body over the bridge handrail, jumping into the darkness below to run away from Song Deokyeon. Song Deokyeon did not pursue him immediately, turning his gaze to Han instead. Han was getting up slowly from the floor, holding his side in pain from the massive injuries he had sustained during the fight. Song Deokyeon threw his blade down onto the ground in front of Han. He told Han that he was going to go catch the bastard that ran away, instructing the boy to hurry up, siphon some blood from the fallen vampire, and go guard the goalpost. Upon saying that, Song Deokyeon jumped over the bridge to hunt down the fleeing male vampire. Han was briefly taken aback by the entire sequence of events, but he knew he had to continue the mission. He reached down and took a syringe, drawing blood from the female vampire's body. He injected the blood directly into himself. As he did, he reasoned that because she belonged to a true vampire's bloodline, the blood felt entirely different from other cheap vampires he had encountered. Han exhaled heavily after the injection, deducing that this potent bloodline was the reason why they were so strong. He instantly felt rejuvenated. His muscles began to bulge, and his physical strength returned fully. Feeling good once more, he picked up the katana from the ground and continued running toward his original destination. The scene cut to a different space inside a building, where several people were lying on the ground, stitched up and badly beaten. Han arrived at the location and looked at the fallen bodies. The grim view in front of him reminded him very much of his father, his mother, and the harsh experiences he had faced when he was a child. He walked into the space, noting the sword and the gun he held with him. He placed the psychedelic moon drug into his mouth, reminding himself that he had trained for this exact moment. Upon biting into the drug, a wave of euphoria washed over him, giving him the precise power he needed to continue the mission, altering the way he perceived the world around him. He exhaled sharply and came back to his senses, grasping the intense energy he had just ingested. He knew it felt completely different from back then. He looked around the room, noting that everything was still a bit hazy as he tried to get himself together. He forced his legs forward, moving into a run as he hurried deeper into the building. When he finally made his way inside the main room, he saw something in front of him that he had never expected, a sight that shocked him to the very bone. The scene turned his shock into pure rage. He gritted his teeth tightly as tears began to stream down his face. He thought to himself that he wished the person in front of him had not died. Looking closer at the bed, he recognized that Jin Yumi was already dead on the mattress. She had been killed by the vampire lady whom Phantom had rescued from the hospital earlier. Though this was an act of revenge for the gruesome treatment the vampire lady had endured from Jin Yumi as a human, the realization filled Han with absolute anger. He looked down at Jin Yumi and stated that in the beginning, the Lord created Adam from dust and created Eve from Adam's bone, calling it a holy ritual of returning to Eden. He slowly raised his gun, pointing the barrel directly at her head, and remarked, "Ashes to ashes, dust to dust." Han pulled the trigger, and a loud bang erupted through the quiet room. The moment the male vampire arrived at the specific spot where he wanted to hide, he was shocked. Standing right there in front of him was Sylvester. Sylvester stood entirely calm, simply glaring down at the vampire. In an instant, Sylvester swung his sword multiple times, executing a swift sequence of strikes that cut through the vampire cleanly. In that exact moment, Song Deok-yeon walked into the area and watched what happened. He was a bit saddened by the state of the target and said to Sylvester that he did not know what he was supposed to do if Sylvester's weapon tore everything apart like this again. He pointed out that there needed to be something left behind to draw a sample from. Sylvester did not waste any time, stating that there was no time to explain. He told him to hurry and go get the kid. Song Deok-yeon paused, realizing the situation, and asked if Sylvester was not coming along with him. Sylvester said no, explaining that there were too many eyes watching their operations now. Song Deok-yeon calculated the meaning behind the words and asked if there was something else involved besides Phantom. Just then, he recognized a deeper threat and questioned Sylvester, asking if it could be Tetra Anax. In that moment, a sudden, bright light shone intensely from behind them, and they immediately began to hear the loud, crackling sound of a massive fire. Flames began to pour out heavily from a massive building nearby. Song Deok-yeon arrived at the chaotic site shortly after, stepping out of his car, glaring upward at the burning building while looking completely speechless. And just then, Han walked slowly out of the blazing building, holding a bag firmly in his hand. Our boy was looking very pale as he stepped away from the heat. Talk about a rough night. Deok-yeon immediately asked the kid if he was okay, but Han glared toward him and simply asked if he could give him a ride away from the space. Right after they moved out, 2 firefighting trucks came into the building area to put out the fire instantly. The firefighters dashed straight into the structure to manage the flames. As the physical scene zoomed backward, Sylvester was standing at a safe distance from the space after they had safely run away. He stood there alone in the dark, glaring intently at the building that was on fire. In that moment, a sharp flash of lightning struck the sky, revealing some birds positioned right in front of him and several cats sitting directly behind him. Sylvester turned his gaze to the cats behind him. He gave them a strict order to spit it out. Complying with his command, the animals began to spit out some spent bullets onto the ground, which were immediately spotted by all the cats behind Sylvester. The moment they finished doing that, Sylvester stood silently in the quiet space. The scene then transitioned cleanly into a past memory. In that remembered space, Sylvester's car was parked outside along the curb, and right in front of it sat Phantom's car. Inside the quiet interior of the Ayuna Cafe, Sylvester confronted Phantom, stating that the vampire had completely lost his mind by barging into Ayuna like this. Phantom remained perfectly composed, responding that the specific matter he had to discuss was simply too urgent to wait. Sylvester scoffed, asking what sudden change of heart had brought him here in person, considering the guy had been actively avoiding him all this time. Phantom looked at him and mentioned that he was sorry to say this now, but he did not think he could ever be a vampire that shed tears for Sylvester's sake, suggesting that the hunter should just go back and bother some other true vampire instead. Sylvester did not care for the deflection. He stated that he had heard enough nonsense, demanding to know his real purpose for coming here. Phantom remained relaxed. He picked up his cup, took a quiet sip of his tea, and told Sylvester not to try too hard to cross paths with Tetra Anax. Sylvester found the statement ironic, noting with surprise that a vampire was actually worrying about a vampire hunter, adding how very grateful he was for the sentiment. Phantom smiled faintly, correcting him that it was not worry at all, but was actually a direct warning. Sylvester's smile vanished. He pulled out his handgun and dropped it heavily onto the wooden table between them. He smiled back at Phantom and stated that he was perfectly fine with doing this right here and right now. Phantom glared across the table, looking a bit annoyed by the escalation. He mentioned that things were very different from the historical days when simple barbarism was the law of the land. He glared sternly at Sylvester, stating that he was the king of vampires and the king of humans alike. Phantom added that today was a special day meant to present the gift of revenge for the child, who had officially become the youngest member of his bloodkin. Upon explaining his stance, he stood up from the table and told Sylvester that he would appreciate it if the hunter did not anger him too much, addressing him as Mr. Stalker. He began to walk slowly out of the cafe, waving his hand to dismiss him while mentioning that since he had delivered all the main points, he would take his leave now. Sylvester sat entirely still at the table, looking thoroughly annoyed, as Phantom offered a final note of thanks for the coffee. The narrative returned directly to the present time, where Sylvester stood with the group. He admitted that he had only assigned Song Deok-yeon to the task out of genuine concern, Muttering how pathetic the outcome felt, Han kept his gaze fixed on him, completely ignoring the comment as he went over to sit down on the couch, not paying Sylvester any real mind. Sylvester looked over at him and remarked that he guessed Han did not achieve what he wanted from that building after all. Hearing that, Han called out to Sylvester. As the older hunter glared back at him, Han asked if he looked like Kurt Cobain to him. Kurt Cobain was the exact name that Jin Yumi had been consistently using to refer to him. Sylvester responded plainly, stating that Han's head must be hurting terribly, seeing as he was spouting complete nonsense. The moment those words were spoken, the emotional weight of the night finally crashed down on Han. He cried out loudly, palming his face tightly as he looked completely disheveled. He tried to calm his posture for a single second, but the distress was too much. He placed both of his arms over his face, bent completely over on the couch, and began to sob, crying heavily while the rain poured down outside under the dark night sky. Song Deokyeon and Sylvester just stood there silently in the room, leaving him to his grief in the pitch silence of the dark surroundings. Much later in the evening, the narrative shifted to a completely different, unfamiliar space. A figure was shown looking entirely awkward and terrified as a massive, unknown creature glared down at him from the shadows. The sheer pressure of the creature's gaze filled the space, signaling the definitive beginning of yet another traumatic story about to unfold. Much earlier, outside a club setting, some men were standing around and discussing various matters amongst themselves. One of the men mentioned to the others that because of their bastard boss, they hardly received any customers anyway, yet he still gave them so much damn work to do. Suddenly, while they were having their conversation, one of them urged the others to wait a second. He began to hear strange sounds coming from a nearby corner, wondering what that noise could possibly be. Looking toward the dark corner, they spotted a strange creature eating someone who was already lying lifeless on the ground. The men began to wonder what the entity was, questioning if it was a beggar, though they noted it was pretty big for a beggar. They questioned whether it was eating something, and wondered exactly what it was consuming. In that moment, they flashed some light directly on the creature, which turned its attention toward them. The men began to ask each other what they should do now, and questioned if they could take the entity on, since it was 3 of them against 1. And suddenly, the creature turned and glared right back at them. It was revealed that the entity had multiple horns on its body, resembling those of a deer, which was very strange. The moment that happened, the men recognized that it was a monster. Before they could do anything to protect themselves, the creature dashed rapidly towards them and grabbed the man who stood in the middle of the group. The man fell heavily to the ground, his head splattering upon impact. The situation was very strange, and the 2 men who were behind stood there entirely helpless, only able to watch as the creature devoured the guy on the floor. The moment the creature finished devouring him, it stood up and glared back at the remaining 2 men. They stood frozen, staring at the creature and wondering if it had just grown bigger. A gruesome scene had just unfolded directly in front of them. The reality of the situation was that the entity was human, but after a traumatic experience, he changed and began to reside in the sewers. And ever since that day, its sense of self had begun to blur completely. Hunger crawled up its body like a physical hand tearing through its throat, and after its mind snapped before it could even resist, it found that by the time it opened its eyes again, it had already devoured countless corpses. Yet, the hunger simply did not stop. The creature began to wonder if humans were always this delicious. Much later, in a different space still during the nighttime, a young man seemed to be doing some exercise as he ran through the area. He suddenly heard a loud sound coming from the sewers directly in front of him. The heavy manhole cover on the ground was pushed violently upwards. The boy was thoroughly shocked, as he wondered what that could possibly be. Just then, a figure jumped out of the sewers, looking incredibly gruesome in its demeanor as it glared at the man in front of it. The moment the creature landed, the boy who was exercising fell backwards onto his ass on the ground. He glared at the creature with an immense amount of fear in his eyes. The creature did not hesitate to dash forward, hunger screaming in its brain as it spotted someone else ahead. The creature grabbed the boy, pushed its bare hand directly into the boy's chest, and tore him into 2 pieces in an instant. It was a completely gruesome scene. Much later, at a particular house, a resident was shining a torch through his window to look outside at what was happening on the streets. The creature stood there roaring as everyone else screamed loudly, running for their lives. But the creature was simply operating on the sole instinct of hunger. The scene then shifted to a different space inside the warehouse where Old Manju works. Song Deokyeon was present there with the old man, asking him if he was suddenly scared of getting caught now or something. Wondering why all the lights were off and noting that he thought the old man went out of business. To this, Old Manju replied that someone actually had to bring in goods for him to do business in the first place. The old man mentioned that whether it was Song Deokyan or that guy Jeong Yong-jin, he had seen neither skin nor hair from any of them lately. Upon hearing this, Song Deokyan merely glared at him without saying a single word. Old Manju then walked up to a specific spot, pulled the cabinet, and switched on the lights from there. And Song Deokyan glared at the illumination. The old man turned, and the view shifted to a different space where multiple televisions suddenly clicked on at that exact moment. The late-night news broadcast began to ring out, reporting an incident in a park in Gangseo-gu, Seoul. As the news broadcast continued, Song Deokyan handed his bag over to Old Manju. The reporter stated that an unidentified entity had killed people in the area. According to a citizen's report, a monster that burst out of a manhole cover had attacked the populace. The news stated that police officials believed it to be an indiscriminate killing committed by a drunkard or a disgruntled individual. But citizens who were at the scene raised their voices to deny such a claim. The witnesses firmly stated that the attacker was not a human, asserting that it could not have been a human. They questioned what kind of alcohol a person would have to drink to commit such gruesome scenes late at night, noting it was incredibly brutal for a person to get split completely in half. Hearing the report, Song Deokyan thought to himself about the friction between vampire hunters and those who are not human, sensing that this must be a corrupted entity. He knew that if there was a single rule those vampire bastards implicitly agreed upon, it was to live strictly in the shadows. He understood that their work must never be revealed to the surface, but that fundamental rule had now been completely shattered. In that moment, Old Manju remarked that vampires trying to handle the situation on their own end would eventually crawl out. While saying this, he placed several bags of blood firmly on the table, and added that hunters looking all big would flock into the area as well. Hearing that, Song Deokyan glared at him, and remarked they were about to experience a real shit show. The scene then cut to the exact space where the mayhem had occurred earlier. A police tag marking a no-entry zone was stretched across the area. The place was completely silent, and everywhere seemed to be engulfed in a pin-drop stillness. The creature was still present in this space, quietly eating the corpses that it had laid waste to. Suddenly, a sharp attack struck the creature directly from behind, hitting it from its blind spot. The creature was thoroughly shocked by the sudden blow. It pulled out the object that had been used against it, and screamed loudly at its hidden attacker. Just then, two men walked calmly into the scene. One of them remarked that it was entirely too noisy. As they stepped into the light, it was revealed that the man speaking was Gyeong, and he was accompanied by one of his subordinates. Gyeong looked at the monster and stated that it would wake up the whole neighborhood if it kept making sounds like that. The man beside Gyeong told Gyeong to move over. The man suddenly brought out some fangs from his hand, intending to use them as a weapon. He took a firm stance as he glared at the creature in front of him, smiled, and told the creature to come on. In an instant, the creature dashed towards the man, ready to attack him, but Yoo-hoo instantly dodged and slashed the creature on its side. The creature screamed loudly from the attack. In that same moment, the man suddenly brought out another weapon from his hand and used it to stab the creature. Much to his surprise, the creature used its hand to grab him before it could sustain that second injury. The man's hand was caught on the creature's hand, and the creature held it very tightly. Before he knew what was going on, the creature struck him straight to the ground, punching him because he had no other way to escape. But suddenly, Gyeong kicked the creature away from his man. The creature flew away through the space from the force of the kick. Gyeong extended his hand, and his hand began to cut on its own. Suddenly, his fingers began to fly like bullets to attack the creature in front of him. They pierced through it multiple times in a display of raw ability, leaving a disheveled being on the floor with multiple holes created around its body. Gyeong retracted his fingers back into place. The guy beside him screamed that Gyeong did not need to help him, claiming he could easily handle this much on his own. In response, Gyeong stated that this was not a game, and told him not to let his guard down. Gyeong smiled and mentioned that, usually in comics, this is exactly where the target gets away. Yoo-hoo responded, telling him not to lie and not to say such unlucky things. Suddenly, something struck him directly in the head, causing a massive hole. The shot killed him instantly, causing Gyeong to be scared as he called out to his companion. Gyeong then saw that the creature he had supposedly killed was actually holding a gun. The creature had used the weapon on Yoo-hoo, which was highly unusual. In that moment, the creature began to shoot multiple bullets at Gyeong, causing Gyeong to run away instantly from that space to avoid sustaining any more damage. He hid securely behind a tree while the creature began to shoot crazily and wondering what else he could possibly do, becoming more and more angry as he screamed loudly, calling the creature a bastard and stating that he would kill it with his own hands. The creature slowly walked up to Yuhu's lifeless body on the ground. A massive mouth was created directly in the creature's stomach. The creature bent down, moved closer to Yuhu, and began to devour him completely. The scene then cut to a different space where Ayuna called out to Han. She welcomed him, noting that he was here at the cafe. Ayuna looked at the motorcycle he had parked outside and mentioned that it was a bike she had never seen before, asking if he had obtained a new one. Our boy responded that he did, explaining that he had luckily found a dealer willing to do business with a minor like him. Hearing this, Ayuna smiled and remarked that it was no wonder his clothes looked cool as well, adding that he had finally become like a hunter. Han stood there quietly, affirming what she had just said. He then asked where Sylvester was, to which she replied that he was sleeping upstairs but might be awake by now. The view shifted to Sylvester upstairs. He was holding a gun and pointed the weapon directly at Han the moment Han tried to walk into his room. Han was briefly startled and told Sylvester that it was good to see him too, wondering internally why he had entered Sylvester's room without permission. Sylvester sat up on the bed and told Han to drop the habit of barging in while people are sleeping, warning him that he never knows when he might get shot or killed. Han walked further into the room and remarked that Sylvester had zero credibility while dressed like that. Sylvester asked what it was about, and Han explained it was about the incidents the media had been buzzing about lately. Sylvester asked if he meant the monster that openly killed people in the park, and Han confirmed that he did, asking for Sylvester's thoughts. Sylvester reasoned that he had expected this, noting that the country still seemed to have vampire clans that had not properly seized control of the underworld, which might be why such things were running rampant. He referred to the creature as a corrupted being and advised leaving it alone, stating it would die on its own. Han countered, pointing out that people were already dying out there. Sylvester sternly told Han not to seek answers from him, reminding him that he was not his tutor, and asked what any of it mattered to Han anyway. Han glared at Sylvester, stating that Sylvester spoke that way, but there was clearly something more to it. Sylvester paused for a second and exhaled heavily. He explained to Han that the blood of a corrupted being itself has no value, but a corrupted being inadvertently attacks executioners. Han was taken aback by this information. Sylvester explained that a corrupted being, existing in a state of flawed mutation, is so thoroughly out of its mind, trying to satisfy its immediate thirst and hunger, that it does not care about hiding its identity. Because of that, high-ranking vampires, who are normally impossible to track, will crawl out to protect their own clans, bearing the title of executioner. Han analyzed the information and asked if that meant using the corrupted being as bait. Sylvester responded that this was correct, noting that for hunters working for money, it was a truly wonderful opportunity. He pulled out his phone and checked a message on the device. The phone displayed an application called Vampire Finder, confirming it was connecting him to the latest information. Sylvester sat on the bed while Han walked up to him, asking what it was. Sylvester told Han to be quiet for a second, as the application began to relay audio information. The app stated that it had information hitting peak value, which everyone must be curious about. It informed them that the corrupted being currently roaming Seoul had been confirmed as the former hunter, Mr. Jung Jun. Sylvester was taken aback by the announcement, remarking that this business seemed like it would be quite cruel for the man. Suddenly, the scene shifted to Song Deok-yeon, who was driving his car with a very ferocious expression. He rode swiftly to the location of the corrupted entity. The scene transitioned to a seaport, where some men stood near a cargo container beside a vehicle carrying goods. One of the individuals dropped a bag heavily to the ground, revealing bundles of dollars inside, and instructed the others to check the contents. A man bent over and began to rummage through the bag before concluding that the amount seemed about right. This person in question was Kenneth Yang, a professional weapons merchant. After checking the payment, Kenneth Yang opened the boot of the car, revealing all the weapons stored inside the vehicle, which included multiple guns and several knives. The buyers stepped closer to inspect the merchandise, concluding that the firearms were excellent. One of them asked if it was truly possible to acquire weapons of this high caliber so easily. Kenneth Yang walked up to the driver's side door of the car and mentioned that, if possible, he would prefer they did not use the firearms to kill people openly, given the strict nature of dealing with such weapons. Upon hearing that advice, a vampire in the group glared at him, suddenly snapped the gun upward to Kenneth Yang's head, and called him a stupid fool, asking why anyone would buy guns if not to kill. Kenneth Yang glared back at him without moving, and warned him that he better not do anything unnecessary. He stood his ground and stated that if they managed to get on the bad side of a capable weapons merchant, All the firearms they were currently holding would turn into scrap metal. He then asked if their weapon brothers had any long-term vision or not. The vampire pressed the weapon closer to his head and cursed at him loudly. The leader of the vampires then walked up, pulled the gun down to stop his man from using it, and explained that he was just playing a little joke. The leader turned to Kenneth Yang and remarked that what was expected from a competent weapons merchant was truly different, noting how composed he remained even with a gun pointed at his back. Kenneth Yang asked if they shouldn't be more amazed by a human who actively deals with vampires. He then added that pointing a gun at a weapons merchant was a very unpleasant thing to do. He made a gun sign with his hand, pointed it directly at them, and stated that starting next time, he would be charging an extra 10%, telling them to keep that in mind. The vampire in front of him repeated the words with a smirk, and the group began to laugh loudly at Kenneth Yang as they walked off, shouting back that they would definitely remember that. They departed into the night, leaving Kenneth Yang alone at the seaport. The moment they were gone, his legs suddenly gave way. He admitted to himself that the children of Hecate were ugly beyond comparison, noting that those guys really had no manners, just like the rumors said. He recognized that it was an incredibly close call, as he had actually just been holding himself up and trying to act strong while the entire encounter unfolded. The scene cut to a different space where Song Deokyeon's car was moving swiftly down the road. The vehicle's radio was playing information, suggesting that perhaps while hunting the Jeokyo clan, the registered vampires ended up changing like that. The broadcast noted it could also be a side effect of psychedelia caused by psychedelic moon. The voice reminded the listeners that there was a substantial bounty on that specific corrupted being, questioning why anyone would care so much about a corrupted entity that usually was not worth much. The reporter explained that with this specific amount, the clan seemed to think their very survival depended on it. While the price for a typical target was standard, this particular bounty was set high for the tracker, offering a whopping 100 million won. Song Deokyeon drove rapidly toward his destination, remarking to himself that it was crazy to think vampires would offer a bounty to vampire hunters. The news broadcast continued, announcing that they had just received a fresh piece of information indicating the monster had appeared once more at the southern end of the Yanghua Bridge near Hangang Park. By the time the report aired, the creature at that location had already laid waste to all the people who had come to attack it. It had grown tremendously in size and looked highly vigorous. The radio announcer added that they were simply delivering the news, and the decision to act remained with the listeners, noting that the entity was completely out of control. Suddenly, a voice cut through the noise at the scene. The creature's attention turned sharply toward two vampires who stood by a corner. They questioned whether the local forces could handle the threat, with one remarking that no matter if it was a corner of the Orient, no one should underestimate the damn police of some trashy country. In that exact moment, the creature dashed violently towards the men in front of him. One of the vampires suddenly packed his hair back, looked at the monster, and asked if it missed him. Upon saying that, he used his own hand to create thick spider webs made of blood. Several spiders emerged from the construct and were propelled directly towards the creature to launch an attack. The spiders began to perch all over the creature's body, causing a large amount of blood to splatter across the area. The creature suddenly fell to the ground on its own, screaming loudly in pain. The vampire's blood spider webs had caught it mid-air, successfully strangling the beast and restricting its movements in an instant. The vampire laughed at the easy capture and asked Echelon, the man standing beside him, why he didn't go ahead and finish the creature off. Echelon was about to move, but he suddenly noticed a movement from the shadows. He yelled to the vampire with the webs to move out of the way immediately. Before the warning could be fully processed, a bullet hole was blasted cleanly through the web-weaving vampire's hand, forcing them both to fall to the ground. Echelon screamed into the darkness, demanding to know who they were. A man stepped forward, smiled, and remarked that in Korea, it seemed the parentless Jeokyo clan lineage vampire bastards were running wild. A group of vampire hunters walked into the scene holding armed weapons, completely surrounding the monster as well as the two vampires who had come to eliminate it. The leader of the vampire hunters stated that catching a high-ranking vampire and a corrupted being at the same time was like killing two birds with one stone, adding that the boss was going to love this result. The leader smiled with a very stern expression. It was evident that all the men in his squad had used psychedelic drugs, as their eyes were glowing a distinct blue color. The bounded vampire was highly annoyed, glaring at the leader and calling him a greedy maniac. The vampire hunter simply responded that being greedy was far better than being crazy for blood, asking the vampire if he was truly any different. Without warning, the squad began to spray a hail of bullets at the targets in front of them. Before the gunfire could pin the vampires down, one of them turned completely into a cluster of bats, dispersing widely to avoid getting hit by the projectiles. He then dashed forward, moving toward the primary vampire hunter in a swift, seamless motion. Smiling fiercely, he told the hunter to go straight to hell, fully prepared to defend his position against the squad that had taken the advantage. The moment Echelon dashed towards the vampire hunter and swung his hand, the vampire hunter smoothly shifted his weight and dodged the first attack. Echelon quickly followed up with a second strike, but the vampire hunter anticipated the movement and evaded that one as well. The vampire hunter seemed to be enjoying the encounter, mentioning to Echelon that he admired his enthusiasm, but questioned if the creature was underestimating humans a little too much. Suddenly, the vampire hunter delivered a sharp kick directly to Echelon's chest, striking him completely when he did not expect it. Before Echelon could recover his footing, the other vampire hunters raised their firearms and began to spray a barrage of bullets at him. That was instantly his end, as his body was destroyed by the multiple bullets tearing through him. He fell to the ground in an instant, unable to do anything to counter their coordinated attack. The vampire hunter leader stood over him, glaring down with a smile. Much later, after the area had settled, the vampire hunters began collecting the blood they needed from the fallen targets. One of the squad members was jubilating and laughing, asking the others how long it had been since they last encountered a high-class vampire. Their leader turned to him and mentioned that since it was the blood of a Gyokyo clan lineage, they needed to take extra care not to get corrupted by it. He then turned toward another squad member who was moving toward the corrupted being. The leader told him to leave that guy alone. The subordinate was surprised by the order, asking if they were not going to catch that guy as well, reminding the leader that there was a substantial bounty on him too. The leader reasoned that the bastard was currently serving as excellent bait. He explained that simply letting him loose like this would cause the other vampires to gather on their own accord, noting that it would be a total waste to settle for just 100 million won. The leader then asked his subordinate for the transmitter, instructing him to bring it over. The troop member handed him a specialized bullet containing the device. In that exact moment, much to their surprise, the corrupted being suddenly pulled out a gun and pointed it directly towards them before they could even process what was happening. However, the corrupted being was dealing with a hunter on a completely different league. The leader did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. He dashed forward instantly and stomped his boot down hard on the creature's hand, effectively stopping him from spraying any bullets at the squad. The vampire hunter smiled as he glared down at the struggling creature, asking aloud where exactly he should stick the device. He pondered with a calm grin whether rumors would spread about where he put it. Upon saying that, he forcefully drove the transmitter straight into the creature's flesh, causing blood to splatter across the immediate ground. The pure pain caused the creature to exert its remaining strength, pushing the man away from its body. As the leader dashed back to create safe distance, the creature began to look very strange and visibly uncomfortable as the transmitter integrated with its system. The vampire hunter observed the reaction, noting with satisfaction that the beast was still lively. He screamed out to his squad, telling them that it was time to move. His men followed immediately as they walked off into the darkness, declaring that a midnight hunt had officially begun. Much later, out on the road, the traffic was moving steadily as the vampire hunters drove through the city inside their vehicles. Suddenly, the leader noticed something obstructing the path ahead, wondering what was happening. A massive truck had been positioned deliberately across the asphalt, completely blocking the road in front of them and causing their vehicles to grind to a halt. In that same moment, the side of the truck opened up, revealing a group of men holding heavy firearms inside the cargo hold. These men were vampires, and they stood firmly in place with their weapons pointed directly at the oncoming cars of the vampire hunters. The leader screamed to his driver, ordering him to turn the car around immediately. Before they could execute the maneuver, one of the vampires grabbed a rocket launcher and fired it instantly. The explosive projectile went flying across the space and struck the leading car carrying the vampire hunters. A massive explosion erupted inside the enclosed tunnel, creating a violent wave of fire that encircled the entire space as the vehicles tumbled over from the sheer force. The vampires stood inside their truck, smiling as they watched the absolute destruction unfold in front of them. The cars were left completely burned up and in shambles. Slowly, the surviving vampire hunters began to crawl out from the wreckage. The leader emerged from the vehicle, spitting out a curse as he looked down at his face, which was already heavily bloodied from the impact. Suddenly, the vampires opened fire, spraying an even greater hail of bullets at the dazed hunters. It was a completely chaotic scene. The vampires were wasting the vampire hunters instantly, leaving them no room to establish a defense. Because their leader had already taken a massive amount of damage, he was completely unable to lead them effectively. The remaining squad members were left scattered like sheep without a shepherd. and the situation turned entirely bad for them. The leader of the vampire group walked up calmly to the bloodied hunter leader. Looking down at him, he asked what this was, recognizing the man and asking if he was not the alchemist Slarky. He remarked that he never expected to see him in such a miserable state, noting that he had no idea the man was here in Korea. The fallen hunter smiled up at the vampire and called them the damned children of Hecate. He asked since when did vampires become so weak that they needed to be heavily armed with human weapons like the ones they were carrying. The leader of the vampires responded, questioning his definition of weakness and suggesting it would be much better to consider it preparedness instead. He bent down closer to the wounded hunter and stated that the true vampire hunter who killed Jeokyo and Chang'un was currently residing in Korea. He reasoned that coming to a country containing a guy like that while completely unarmed would be even more laughable. He asked if the hunter agreed, and before the man could even attempt to respond, the vampire pulled the trigger. The shot blasted cleanly through, killing him instantly. Once the area was secure, the vampire leader ordered his men to search the body, stating that there must be a tracking device on him. One of the subordinates rummaged thoroughly through the dead hunter's pockets and pulled out the physical tracking device. He held it up to his leader, mentioning that it looked like an FM type of GPS tracker. The leader smiled. He then suggested to his crew that they should have a brief midnight snack from the bodies first, before they continued their mission. Before anyone could utter another word, a sudden gunshot cut through the silence. A bullet struck the subordinate who had just pulled out the GPS tracker, and his body went completely limp, falling dead to the ground. The vampire leader's smile vanished as he thought to himself that this was a specialized cellular bullet. He grew deeply uncomfortable, turning his head rapidly as he tried to spot exactly where the projectile could have come from. He forced his gaze forward through the dim lighting of the tunnel and recognized the figure standing in front of him. It was the true vampire hunter, Sylvester, who stood firmly in the space with his weapons held ready in his hands. Sylvester glared at the gathered vampires, remarking calmly that there were quite a lot of unwelcome guests present here today, fully prepared to lay waste to every single one of them in the night. The moment Sylvester arrived, he wasted no time using his sword to slice cleanly through the vampires that were in front of him. Just as Sylvester cut through the majority of the vampires with absolute ease while dashing forward, the leader added that he could not help but be impressed by his skills. In that moment, the leader laughed aloud as he threw his own weapon away. He dashed rapidly towards Sylvester, stating that for beings like them who were thoroughly accustomed to death and whose daily lives had become so dull, Sylvester was surely the most magnificent reaper. The moment the creature dashed at Sylvester, its first attack was easily evaded as Sylvester shifted his weight. Sylvester noted that his action was strictly for erasing the creature's pain, and he struck the guy instantly, cutting him into two pieces with a single, delicate movement. Sylvester glared forward at the collapsing form, telling the vampire not to assign any deep meaning to the act. The scene then transitioned to the corrupted being, Jongjun, who was running frantically through the space, moving swiftly while his bare body was covered in sweat. Suddenly, a voice called out from the darkness, ordering him to stop right there. A couple of other vampires walked into the space, led directly by Cheon Young-ho. Cheon Young-ho looked at the creature's face and remarked on his ugly mug, asking if he was really a human once. He stated that it was truly an unappealing visual. He then called out to the boys behind him, instructing the vampires in his squad to wrap things up quickly. The crew began to move forward toward the corrupted being, as Cheon Young-ho added that they should finish the job and clock out before the sun came up. The vampires instantly dashed towards the corrupted being to try and get rid of him, but they quickly realized they were completely out of their depth. The corrupted being swung his massive hand and stabbed the first attacker instantly, before jumping upward to clear through the remaining forces in front of him. The more vampires that dashed towards him, the more they understood they were no match against his raw power, especially when the creature grabbed one attacker by the mouth and tore his head completely away from his body. It was a very jarring sight. Cheon Young-ho recognized that this creature was not something on their level, wondering what the hell was up with that bastard, and questioning if the entity was simply not ready for a finishing blow yet. Suddenly, the squad noticed that the body of the corrupted being was dripping with an immense amount of sweat. One vampire in particular managed to sneak up from behind to launch a stealth attack. Cheon Young-ho grew excited, fully expecting this vampire to finally end the creature's rampage. Before the attacker could land a blow, a gun clicked in the shadows. A man swung his gun upward and shot a bullet directly into the attacking vampire. The struck creature fell limp to the ground instantly, as if the shooter had done it specifically to protect the corrupted being. It was Han who had fired the shot. Walking calmly into the illuminated space, our boy looked at Cheon Young-ho and remarked that he did not expect to meet him again like this, noting that it had been a while. Jian Young-ho stood there, glaring intensely at Han as he stepped into view. Han looked around the area and stated that he guessed Song Deok-yeon had not arrived yet. Han's face. Suddenly, the corrupted being began to strain violently. It strangely started to articulate words, calling out Han's name. This came as a complete shock to Han, who turned and glared at the creature. Something began to bubble up inside the corrupted being's throat, and it suddenly vomited a couple of bones and various half-digested contents from its belly straight onto the ground. Han was thoroughly shocked as he stared down at the remains on the floor. Taking advantage of the distraction, Jian Young-ho turned on his heel and began to run away from the scene. Han did not even flinch. He simply pointed his gun toward the fleeing figure and asked where he thought he was going. He fired a single bullet directly into Jian Young-ho's leg. Jian Young-ho screamed out loudly in agony before tripping over his own feet, hitting his head violently against the handrail by the corner of the road and passing out from the heavy injury to his skull. Behind him, the corrupted being began to undergo a strange transformation. The deer-like horns on its body seemed to be melting away as it slowly walked towards Han, its flesh destabilizing. By the time it arrived directly in front of Han, its body had melted down significantly, leaving it looking very disheveled and incredibly small compared to the massive size it had previously maintained. Han stood still and simply allowed the creature to walk past him into the night, as if they shared a silent, mutual understanding. Jian Young-ho slowly regained consciousness, blinking through the pain, and began to scream, asking why Han was letting the monster pass by so easily. Han walked up to the injured man, looked down at him, and asked if he was Jian Young-ho. He questioned if the man even knew what the Songdong gang had done to him, remembering the immense frustration he had faced with the female vampire who had taken Jin Yumi's life. He thought about how his parents had been broken by their actions, and he deduced that talking about it any further would be completely meaningless. After all, there was no going back, and the damage had already been done. Han cocked his weapon. He looked down at the man and remarked that, thanks to him, he had gained some good experience. Jian Young-ho began to beg desperately for his life, pleading with Han to stop. Han ignored the cries, pointed the barrel directly at Jian Young-ho's head, and his face remained completely devoid of emotion as the shot went off, muttering that the man shouldn't have poked his nose where it did not belong. After securing the area, Han pulled out his phone to check his coordinates. The scene then cut to the dark, damp underground sewers where the corrupted guy had retreated back to his base. Suddenly, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed through the tunnel. Song Deok-yeon stepped out of the shadows, looking at the creature, and stating that he had ended up owing that young brat a debt. The sound of Song Deok-yeon's voice caused the corrupted being to turn its head sharply. Song Deok-yeon looked closely at the entity and addressed him as Captain Zhong, recognizing the man beneath the mutation. Hearing his old name caused the creature to experience an immense surge of psychological pain, as his human memories began to turn violently against his fractured mind. The creature screamed out in agony and suddenly dashed with full force towards Song Deok-yeon. Song Deok-yeon remained perfectly calm and stood his ground, taking a firm combat stance with his gun held tightly in his hand. He looked at the oncoming creature and remarked that being completely unable to shed tears in a moment like this seemed to be a trait shared by more than just vampires. In the past, Jongjun had a lovely family consisting of his wife and a son, and his wife had been pregnant with their second child. His son would always jump toward him whenever he was about to leave the house, asking his dad when he was coming back home. It was a consistently lovely experience that he cherished deeply. Jongjun would ask his son if he should come home early that day so they could all go out to eat together, and his son would grow excited, stating that he loved his dad and would absolutely love that. But everything suddenly shattered. One day, he returned to the property only to find his son completely lifeless on the ground, and his wife lifeless beside him, while their entire building was burning. Jongjun wept heavily in that moment, sustaining a heavy injury across his face, while frantically trying to pull his family out of the collapsing structure. The building was completely on fire, and that was exactly how he lost his wife and his son. It was a chaotic situation that scarred Jongjun physically and mentally for the rest of his life. Back in the present, the figure previously referred to as the Corrupted, now revealed to be Jongjun, a former vampire hunter, stood in front of Song Deok-yeon, exerting every ounce of his remaining strength to restrain himself from launching an attack. Observing the immense struggle, Song Deok-yeon questioned what kind of bullshit this was, ordering the bastard to at least try and attack him. Jongjun tried incredibly hard to suppress his violent impulses. Song Deok-yeon deduced that the creature was hesitating out of some lingering attachment to its past humanity. He palmed his face in frustration, remarking that he was a total failure as a teacher. In that tense moment, Jongjun managed to call out Song Deokyeon's name once more. Song Deokyeon simply pointed his gun directly at the corrupted being's head, telling him that his head hurt and ordering him to just shut up. He stated that there was simply no way to go back to how things were before. He pulled the trigger, executing the shot cleanly, and that was finally that. The scene transitioned to a completely different location much later in the morning. A few policemen were moving diligently across the perimeter, and as the view focused closer, Song Deokyeon was resting heavily against his car after an exhausting day. In that moment, our boy Han and Sylvester walked directly into the scene. Han looked at the older hunter and asked if he had really taken care of him. Song Deokyeon looked back at Han, asking if the kid thought he would fake the kill just so he could do something ridiculous like suck out the target's brains. Sylvester stepped forward and asked Song Deokyeon if he was planning to claim the standard bounty on the head. Song Deokyeon exhaled a long breath, noting that both Jongjun and himself had no family left whatsoever, so he would simply consider the bounty money as a personal inheritance. Pulling out the syringe, he injected himself with the psychedelic moon directly in its most potent form. Han screamed at the act, surprised that he didn't even dilute the substance before injecting it. Sylvester immediately corrected the youth, warning our boy not to overstep his bounds. Sylvester noted that in this moonlit night, everyone had their own specific way of maintaining their sanity. Han looked away from the older men, mentioning that, regardless of the cost, the true nature of vampires was going to be properly exposed to the world because of this incident. Sylvester told Han not to underestimate vampires, casting his gaze upward toward a bird that was glaring down at them from a perch. The bird was indeed a vampire tracking them. Sylvester repeated his warning to Han, stating that blinding and silencing humans was absolute child's play for the children of Tetra-Anax. The bird suddenly shifted in a swift movement and flew away from them into the morning sky while the group watched its departure. Much later, inside the massive building belonging to Phantom, the true vampire was speaking directly with Wilhelm. Wilhelm walked up to his master and reported that most of the cleanup operation was officially done. Wilhelm mentioned that they had successfully gagged the media exactly as instructed, but he asked his master if everything would truly be all right moving forward. Phantom stated that it simply could not be helped. He reasoned that even if the public did not quiet down as much as they hoped, they had done the absolute best they could do, and Tetra-Anax would not press the issue too much either. Wilhelm commented that it was bad enough the hunter had lost his entire family simply because he caught their eye. But for a former vampire hunter to end up being hunted with a massive bounty on his own head was truly cruel. Phantom responded by stating that such was the way of Tetra-Anax, the ancient vampire lord who controls human society through telepathy and possesses the power of foresight. He explained that the reason their kind had been able to settle seamlessly within human society for thousands of years was partly thanks to this exact type of ruthless protection. Wilhelm nodded, recognizing the truth in the statement, and adding that it was much better to at least pretend to be completely obedient like this. Phantom replied that if they did not follow those rules, they might have ended up completely eradicated, like the Jeokyo clan. Wilhelm expressed his immediate annoyance, asking his master please not to say such unsettling things, which caused Phantom to laugh at his reaction. Phantom then calmed his tone and noted that it was always better to maintain less groundless optimism, because a contradictory piece like theirs could never last forever. Much later, at a different location down by the sea dock, Kenneth Yang was shivering violently in the biting cold. The weapons merchant complained to himself about the freezing temperature, muttering that even though he knew it was winter, it should still be a bit warmer by the sea. He grumbled about the moonlit night, thinking he was going to die from climate change before he even had his blood sucked. He stood entirely alone in the freezing cold. The moment Kenneth Yang arrived at his headquarters, he immediately recognized that the main door was standing wide open, which made him feel deeply uncomfortable. He grabbed his firearm in preparation, tracing his movements carefully as he walked into the room to track down whoever had entered his space, and asked if he had suddenly gotten popular. He questioned just how urgently the guy needed goods to break in before the shop was even opened, noting that making a first impression like this made it incredibly hard to offer a good price. The intruder did not move a muscle and remained completely calm. He smoothly closed the book he was reading in that moment, turned his head, and looked directly at Kenneth Yang, stating simply that he was finally here. His sheer presence caused Kenneth Yang to become very scared, his hands trembling as he recognized the vampire's face and gasped out his name. Sayuk. Sayuk glared back at Kenneth Yang, remarking that it was impressive to see all the great goods the merchant had stashed away, noting that he must be working really hard. Kenneth Yang tried to speak, asking when exactly Sahyuk had gotten back to Korea. Sahyuk cut him off instantly, stating that because Kenneth Yang had worked so hard selling high-grade weapons to various vampires, quite a few of his own comrades had died. He added that his people had lost absolutely everything, ranging from heavy weapons to bulletproof vests. Sahyuk began to walk slowly and deliberately toward Kenneth Yang, stating that the losses were far too great, so he believed he needed to be heavily compensated somehow. Kenneth Yang began to laugh in an unsettled, uncontrollable manner, stammering that there must be a massive misunderstanding about the situation. Before the merchant could utter another syllable, Sahyuk lunged forward and grabbed Kenneth Yang's weapon right at his face. Sahyuk stated that for a very long time, human history had been riddled with misunderstandings and hostility. Sahyuk forced the metal weapon hard against Kenneth Yang's face, asking what difference it would honestly make if he added just one more misunderstanding to the list. He looked into the merchant's eyes, stating that he preferred to stay misunderstood, and forcefully shoved the blade of the weapon straight inside Kenneth Yang's mouth. The action left the merchant completely terrified and uncomfortable. In that moment, Kenneth Yang was extremely scared, but Sahyuk looked down at him and stated that normally he would have to take his life. However, Sahyuk explained that he was planning to settle down in Korea for a while. He noted that no matter where he looked, it turned out Kenneth Yang was the only reliable arms dealer in the country. Therefore, to deepen their friendship, Sahyuk had come to see him in person. Kenneth Yang was already flat on the floor. Sahyuk had completely crushed Kenneth Yang's weapon to pieces, and had already beaten the arms dealer to a pulp. Through the pain, Kenneth Yang deduced that the man had a specific request, to which Sahyuk replied that he must make sure he does not do any business with vampires from now on. Kenneth Yang responded, mentioning that such a demand might be a little difficult to fulfill since selling those weapons was his literal livelihood. The moment those words left his mouth, Sahyuk struck Kenneth Yang once more across the face. Sahyuk delivered a heavy kick that sent Kenneth Yang flying instantly across the room until his back struck the wall hard, causing him to scream out in agony. Sahyuk smoothly lit a smoke and remarked that playing hard to get with another guy was simply not his taste. He walked over to the slumped arms dealer, bent over directly in front of him, and blew a thick cloud of smoke straight into Kenneth Yang's face. The sensory blast caused Kenneth Yang to cough loudly and violently. Sahyuk commented that, as expected, the taste of a lucky strike was something truly special, asking if the merchant agreed. Kenneth Yang could barely even mutter a word of response through his bruised jaw, managing only to state that he had not found anything better than Mod 7. Upon hearing this, Sahyuk noted that he did not expect them to have a difference of opinion on the matter. He shrugged it off, stating that since his own friends had gotten a bit roughed up because of Kenneth Yang's sales, he was currently looking to replenish his squad of comrades. Sahyuk then asked Kenneth Yang if he knew any good hunters anywhere around. Kenneth Yang asked Sahyuk who he had in mind. Sahyuk replied that he had heard the true vampire hunter, Father Sylvester, was currently in Korea, and suggested that Kenneth Yang introduce himself to him. Kenneth Yang gradually forced himself up from the floor and asked Sahyuk if he was completely crazy, or if he had lost his mind. He questioned if Sahyuk was saying that simply because he lacked understanding of what kind of dangerous guy Sylvester truly was. Sahyuk smiled thinly, remarking on being called crazy. He asked the dealer how he had fallen so low, asserting that he actually followed public etiquette remarkably well. To prove his point, Sahyuk stated that he even practiced strict fire prevention. Right after saying that, Sahyuk deliberately put out the burning smoke directly onto the bare skin of Kenneth Yang's neck. The intense heat caused Kenneth Yang to scream out loudly in pain. Sahyuk looked at him calmly, telling him to endure it, reasoning that for a struggling student, a little cigarette burn was something anyone would have a few of. He told him not to make such a massive fuss over a minor issue. Sahyuk glared at him, stating that the merchant simply needed to share Sylvester's location, and he'll take care of the rest. Kenneth Yang was barely trying to breathe, gasping for air against the weight of the room. Sahyuk observed his struggle and suggested that instead of continuing this painful interrogation, it might be much faster to just go through his personal notebook or his phone. Kenneth Yang suddenly jolted in terror and screamed, stating that he understood completely, so Sahyuk needed to stop. Sahyuk stood back up to his full height and asked if he had suddenly changed his mind. As Kenneth Yang slowly rose from the floor, Sahyuk remarked on what a fickle friend he truly was. The scene then transitioned to a completely different space inside the Ayuna Cafe. Inside the quiet shop, the lady who owned the establishment, Ayuna, had recently hired a new lady named Jinye to work with her. Ayuna was currently showing her the ropes and explaining the basic running of the cafe. In that exact moment, the front door swung open. Sah-hyuk walked heavily into the cafe, followed closely by a multiple number of his men. They walked straight up to the cashier counter and glared at Ayuna, while the other men began fanning out to inspect the physical space. Ayuna maintained her composure and smiled. She calmly turned to Jin-hye, asking her to go inside the back room. Jin-hye intuitively understood the gravity of the situation. She quickly hid around the corner and closed the door behind her. With the room cleared of the new hire, the cafe owner smiled politely at the leader and welcomed Sah-hyuk to the establishment. Sah-hyuk smiled back at her, stating that it was nice to meet her. He pulled out a sleek business card and handed it to her to identify himself. The card explicitly read, "Illegal Blood Distribution Association Director Sah-hyuk." Ayuna glared down at the text on the card and acknowledged him. She then asked what specific business had brought him to her cafe. Sah-hyuk replied that he had come there to have some delicious coffee, of course. Ayuna looked him in the eye and asked if he had actually come there looking for Sylvester. Sah-hyuk conceded that the truth must have been completely obvious. Ayuna then asked if he was supposed to be a vampire hunter. She followed up by pointing out that barging into a peaceful business as a large group with heavy weapons hidden entirely under their coats would clearly interfere with her daily operations. Upon hearing her blunt observation, all of Sah-hyuk's men sitting around the space began to look a bit unsettled and tense. Sah-hyuk quickly waved his hand at them, signaling for his crew to calm down. He turned back to Ayuna, remarking that he supposed such disruption was considered an issue in a country known for its Eastern manners. While this heavy conversation was unfolding at the counter, our boy Han was sitting quietly in the corner, keeping a low profile. Sah-hyuk's attention suddenly shifted across the room, snapping directly onto him. Sah-hyuk addressed Han, calling him his young friend, and stated that he had been worrying lately because there simply were not any good people around to hire. He added that if it was a young man of Han's obvious caliber, they could treat him exceptionally well. Saying this, Sah-hyuk grabbed a nearby chair and sat down facing him. He looked at Han and asked if he had any thoughts on partnering up with their organization. Han slowly rose up from his seat and let out a casual yawn. He questioned why this offer was suddenly being dropped on him, asking if the mister really wanted him to join his gang. Sah-hyuk scoffed slightly at the term, questioning his use of the word gang. He countered that it was more accurately described as a formal job offer. He explained that when several people with the exact same goal gather together, they can achieve massive results that one could not even imagine accomplishing alone. He admitted that due to the illicit nature of their industry, standard corporate benefits were a bit of a stretch. However, Sah-hyuk clarified that Han would receive a completely separate base salary, and if his combat performance was good, they would definitely hook him up with heavy financial incentives. This specific mention of money seemed to impress Han. Our boy looked at Sah-hyuk and asked if that was really the case. Sah-hyuk elaborated further to seal the deal, stating that their group possessed stabilization devices, VT measuring devices, and even psychedelic moon extraction devices entirely in-house. He reasoned that they could quickly secure an established distribution network directly to 4-year-olds, meaning that whatever targets they hunted could be distributed straight to the market without relying on a third-party broker. This meant Han would never have to worry about losing his profit margins. Sah-hyuk noted that Han knew very well how much profit those greedy brokers had been taking from them until now. Sah-hyuk then leaned in closer, his tone turning incredibly sharp as he stated that above all else, their welfare facilities were absolutely killer. He asked the youth what he thought and if he cared to join them, moving his hand forward to firmly grab Han by the shoulder. Han looked directly at him and stated that he thanked him for the offer, but he would pass. Upon hearing this, Sah-hyuk smiled thinly and remarked that the young man was going to regret this decision. Suddenly, a new voice cut cleanly through the room, demanding to know who they were. It was Sylvester, who had just walked into the cafe. The moment the hunter entered the space, Sah-hyuk turned his attention to him, acknowledging him as the illustrious true vampire hunter. Sah-hyuk walked straight up to him and mentioned that he had heard a lot about him, but noted that Sylvester was much younger than he had originally expected. Sylvester did not waver, ordering the man to get straight to the point, because he had absolutely no desire to watch him open his vile mouth to spout garbage. Sah-hyuk tried to explain, but before he was able to continue, Sylvester cut him short and simply said, "Rejected." Sylvester glared at him, asking if it was clear before he instructed Sah-hyuk to get lost. Upon saying this, Sah-hyuk was extremely annoyed by the blatant disrespect. While at the corner of the room, we see Han sitting there, laughing calmly at the escalating tension. Sah-hyuk tried to smooth things over, telling Sylvester not to be like that, and asking him to just let him finish his thought. But before he could continue, Sylvester suddenly pulled out his weapon and placed it directly in front of Sayuk's head. In that same moment, the atmosphere shifted instantly. All the men who had followed Sayuk into the cafe pulled out their weapons and targeted Sylvester. The situation became very heated suddenly, the room completely locking up with physical tension. Sylvester looked past the gun barrels and said to Sayuk that for someone who came fleeing all the way to Korea, he still had not properly grasped his place, addressing him directly as the alchemist. Sayuk maintained his composure and argued that if Sylvester was truly going to hunt down true vampires, he should at least hear him out before deciding. He asked if Sylvester didn't need to shake up the vampires that much anyway. Sylvester looked at him coldly and countered that Sayuk was a businessman, stating that this fact alone made the negotiations a complete failure. This response made Sayuk even more angry as he glared at Sylvester. Then, suddenly, Sayuk smiled. He recognized how things stood, stating that he saw how it was. He walked cleanly past him, pardoning his intrusion, and announced to his crew that they would take their leave then. Upon saying that, all the other men put away their weapons and began to follow Sayuk to walk out of the cafe. Sayuk seemed visibly annoyed as he exited, leaving the others behind in the quiet space. Much later that evening, back inside the building, the remaining group began to converse once more. Han looked over at the rest of the group and asked if they actually knew him. Sylvester explained the situation, noting that, yeah, he was the guy people in the underworld called the Alchemist. Han repeated the name, realizing the man even had a specific nickname, and asked what that title was actually supposed to mean. Sylvester told him that, if he was so curious, he should just go ask the man himself. Ayuna came to the rescue to break down the details simply. She explained that, simply put, the nickname meant he was completely different from other ordinary hunters. She noted that he doesn't just supply raw blood packs, but he even produces the psychedelic moon enhancement drug himself, not to mention distributing it across the market as well. She added that since they operate as a highly organized group, the amount of money they make at any one time must be massive. Han parsed the information, concluding that massive amounts of psychedelic moon were being manufactured from massive amounts of harvested blood. Ayuna confirmed the deduction, stating that was exactly right. She explained that what the man was blabbering to him about earlier, calling it a business proposal, was exactly why he originally earned that nickname, the Alchemist. Upon hearing this, Han thought about the encounter. He understood the weight behind the man's operation, figuring that the guy wasn't just full of hot air after all. Ayuna continued the conversation, mentioning that she had thought he mostly operated over in the United States, so seeing him show his face here in Korea was definitely strange. She added that the rumors about the American market completely crashing over there must be true. Sylvester spoke up, noting that, well, it was obviously Sayuk's own sloppy doing that caused the market to crash in the first place. Ayuna shook her head, stating that regardless of his sketchy methods, in the world of vampires, he was a man known to be positioned near the very top. She then looked towards Sylvester with a smirk, adding that, of course, he was still no Sylvie. Sylvester was thoroughly annoyed. He turned to Ayuna and strictly stated that he had told her repeatedly not to call him Sylvie. Meanwhile, we see as Han began to look even more interested, fixing his gaze on the business card that had been handed out by Sayuk earlier. Han spoke up, suggesting that if the man was truly at that high of a level, they should at least get properly acquainted with him. He looked over at Sylvester, reasoning that Tetra Anax had already started keeping a close eye on their movements anyway, so establishing a more collaborative infrastructure between active hunters would only be better for them. But Sylvester immediately shut the idea down, saying no very sternly. He told Han that it was incredibly rare for him to actually come up with a good idea, but his target this time was dead wrong. He warned Han that the Sayuk guy simply isn't someone in his right mind. Hearing this, Han pulled his jacket tight. He countered by asking who exactly in this brutal line of business was ever in their right mind. He turned his back and walked off toward the door. Sylvester called out after him, demanding to know where exactly he was going. Han simply glared back over his shoulder, telling Sylvester that it wasn't like he was particularly sane either, and then he walked cleanly out into the night. Ayuna looked at the doorway and asked Sylvester if he shouldn't have physically stopped him from leaving, noting that the kid needed to be careful after what had happened with Mr. Xiangxiang's incident anyway. But the group was completely unable to stop Han. The scene then cut to a different space down the road, where some cars were moving swiftly through the evening traffic. Inside the main vehicle, Sayuk was sitting comfortably, holding a lit smoke in his hand. He looked over at his driver and remarked that to suffer such a blatant insult from Sylvester was truly fitting for an encounter with a true vampire hunter. The driver kept his eyes on the road and asked if they should just get rid of him for the disrespect. Sayuk laughed at the question, asking how exactly the driver planned to take on a literal monster that haunts true vampires all by himself. The direct question made the driver feel instantly uncomfortable. Sayuk waved his hand, telling him to just forget it, noting that there are simply some dangerous people in this world you should never antagonize. The driver paused, then asked what they should do about the other guy who had been sitting back in the cafe. Sayuk picked up interest at the mention, a sudden realization hitting him as he noted, "Ah, that young guy with the green hair." He told the driver to leave him alone as well. He remembered the details of their brief conversation, mentioning that the youth flourished a quiet confidence despite being young. Sayuk pointed out that the kid wouldn't even look him in the eye when he spoke to him, choosing to just keep yawning instead. The driver frowned, asking if that wasn't just the kid being a disrespectful brat. Sayuk laughed out loud at the thought, stating that he guessed if you just look at it from a surface level, then sure. But he explained that Greenhorn didn't glance at him when the offer was made, because he was actually sizing up every single person in the room. Sayuk suddenly laughed loudly, explaining that the kid was definitely calculating exactly how many of their armed men he could physically take on by himself. He smiled, remarking that the behavior was just completely adorable. Sayuk looked past his reflection in the window beside him, as he noted that the kid smelled incredibly strongly of blood as well. He smiled to himself, gathering that the youth was just like him. The thought made him excited, and he admitted that thinking about it like that only made him want to recruit the kid even more. Sayuk turned back to the driver and remarked that, well, if it's truly meant to be, a day will eventually come when they meet again beautifully. The driver caught the underlying meaning, asking if Sayuk was basically telling him to keep close track of the youth's physical movements. Sayuk laughed softly, telling the driver that he caught on quick. The driver glared toward the rearview mirror, still feeling a bit uncomfortable with the task, as the car kept on riding straight toward their destination under the dark evening sky. That evening at a particular location, Han arrived and began to examine the business card he had received. He called the number listed on it, only to discover that the number did not even exist. He looked at the card and wondered if the email address shown was actually valid, feeling entirely uncertain. Turning his attention back toward the city, he sat there on the bench in his usual spot, feeling deeply annoyed because the details of the card were completely useless. Much later, Han arrived at the house where he laid his head. He reflected on the fact that he now possessed a weapon and was strained by his current circumstances. He had believed that this time would be different from what he had experienced when he was young, frail, and entirely lacking in experience. He traced his thoughts back to the past, knowing that he had truly wanted to stop the tragedy and protect that lady, Jin Yumi. But when push came to shove, he had been completely unable to do anything. He felt bad for acting all smuggish when Jin Yumi tried to know his name and introduced himself to her in the calmness of his memories. It was a realization that came far too late, as she had already passed away. He walked outside into the cool evening air, and suddenly, his medallion began to signify that a vampire was nearby. He looked up immediately as a voice remarked on the nice-looking necklace he was wearing. The person standing before him was Gyeong from earlier. Gyeong glared at him with a sharp smile, offering a brief greeting. Recognizing that the man was a vampire, Han instantly pulled out his firearm, concluding that he should have at least attached a silencer to the weapon before stepping out. But before he could adjust, Gyeong dashed from his position and noted that Han had good judgment. Before Han could react, Gyeong swung his leg, striking Han directly on one of his hands to deflect the weapon, weaving his strike cleanly through the space. Han managed to dodge the follow-up attack. Gyeong observed his movements, mentioning that Han's combat sense was not bad for a human. In an instant, the two began to throw a flurry of rapid attacks at each other, with each doing their very best to dodge the incoming blows. Suddenly, Gyeong came clutch with a powerful high kick. The moment the kick came into contact, it struck Han heavily from the side of his shoulder. The sheer force sent our boy flying straight across the space until his back struck the wall with a dull thud. Gyeong walked up to the downed youth and commented that just as humans hunt vampires, they should have at least considered that vampires can hunt humans too. He raised his leg, aiming it directly at Han's face, and asked if Han was being a bit too naive. The moment Gyeong tried to step down on him, Han grabbed the vampire firmly by the leg. This sudden display of strength was very surprising to Gyeong. Gyeong looked down at him, asking if he had taken that already. He deduced the truth instantly. Han had already consumed the psychedelic drug to serve as an artificial enhancement for his physical strength. With his strength surged, Han forcefully pushed Gyeong away. Gyeong stood waiting, fully expecting Han to dash forward to continue the assault. but much to his surprise, Han turned and ran away instead. Gyeong licked his lips at the sight, remarking that a hunt was no fun if the prey got caught too easily. He immediately gave chase, tracking Han's movements through the shadows. Han arrived at a particular spot further down, gasping heavily. He recognized that this opponent had a completely different vibe from the previous enemies he had faced so far, and he knew he needed to get away first to regroup. Before he could even make his move, Gyeong's voice echoed out once more, asking if he was enjoying his job. Han pivoted instantly, pulling out his weapon and firing multiple bullets directly at Gyeong. Gyeong showed incredible speed, dodging the incoming bullets as he closed the distance and dashed toward Han in an instant. Gyeong grabbed Han's hand mid-motion, forcefully pushing it aside to deflect the gunfire and change the course of the bullets. Gyeong told him that he should at least use his turn properly, signaling his dominance before cutting back in with another strike. As Han began to fall backward from the physical pressure, he managed to place his foot firmly against Gyeong's head. Seizing the sudden leverage, Han held tightly onto Gyeong's hand and executed a classic counter-grappling technique, kicking Gyeong away while simultaneously breaking free from the vampire's hold. Han landed heavily on the ground. Huffing and puffing loudly from the intense exertion, he reached behind his back and drew a sharp dagger. Gyeong was taken completely aback by the quick recovery. He looked at the armed youth, mentioning that Han was not half bad, and took a firm, low stance directly in front of Han, both of them fully prepared to brawl right then and there. The heated battle between Han and Gyeong continued. Han swung his weapon and pushed forward. He realized that even after taking the enhancement drug, his attacks were not reaching the target at all. As the struggle strained his body, a vivid memory surfaced. Han remembered screaming at someone in the past, declaring that those monsters deserved to die. He had argued back then that whether it was profitable or not, letting those creatures live was no different from allowing a spreading plague to thrive. A brief wave of internal shock hit him as he faced his current reality. After talking so confidently back then, he felt entirely pathetic looking like this in a real confrontation. Han was struggling to find his footing against Gyeong, who was easily dodging every single one of his strikes. Gyeong was ever agile. In one fluid motion, the vampire grabbed both of Han's hands together, pinning them in a tight grip that rendered the youth completely unable to move. Gyeong looked down at him, noting that Han fought somewhat better than he had originally expected. However, without breaking his grip, Gyeong instantly delivered a heavy punch straight to Han's face, mentioning that the youth was far too sloppy to be called the disciple of a true vampire hunter. The force of the punch sent Han flying backward through the space. He crashed hard, hitting the ground face first with his cheek sliding against the dirt. Before he could even attempt to push himself up, Gyeong stepped heavily onto Han's face, pinning him to the ground. Gyeong remarked that before the youth died, telling him exactly who was taking his life was simply the polite thing to do. He looked down at the pinned hunter and stated that his name was Gyeong, of the Jeokyo clan. Han glared up at him through the dirt, asking who exactly said that he was dying. Gyeong looked mildly surprised by the defiance. He mentioned that he did have a specific request regarding Han from Wilhelm, but added that simply taking his life would be no fun, and there was absolutely nothing to gain from it. Gyeong then asked how Han felt about being reborn instead. Han was taken completely aback by the proposition, feeling deeply uncomfortable as the weight of the situation settled in the quiet space. Gyeong used his own finger to slice a small cut into his skin. He mentioned that it felt a bit strange to boast about it himself, but in terms of power measurements, he was actually ranked within the top 10 of the entire Jeokyo clan. Han looked visibly distressed while Gyeong's leg continued to rest heavily on his face. Gyeong told him that he would be reborn as someone who truly walks beneath the moonlit night. In that exact moment, the stern words of Songdeok-yeon flashed vividly through Han's memory. Songdeok-yeon had once warned him in a very strict tone, telling him never to become something like a vampire. His mentor had made it perfectly clear that he would never go easy on Han, regardless of having raised him, if he ever turned into one of those creatures. Anchored by that memory, Han looked up at Gyeong and questioned the logic of telling a hunter to turn into the prey. He asked if all the blood-sucking had completely messed with the vampire's head. Gyeong's expression turned vicious. He cursed loudly, stating that the youth was sticking to his arrogant act until the very end. Losing his patience, Gyeong reached down and grabbed Han tightly by the neck, but before he could squeeze, a new voice broke cleanly through the space. Wondering what exactly was going on here, Gyeong snapped his attention toward the sound, spotting Sahyuk standing by the corner. Sahyuk walked casually into the area, mentioning that he had heard gunshots nearby and decided to come take a look. He glared at the two of them, remarking that things were suddenly getting very interesting. Gyong dropped Han roughly to the ground, turning his full attention to the newcomer, and demanded to know who he was. Sahyuk remained calm, stating that he would like to be called Sahyuk. Sahyuk closed the distance further, offering a deal. He stated that if Gyong left the kid alone and got lost right now, he would let him go for the day without coming after him. He asked Gyong what he thought of the proposal, noting it was a win-win scenario. Gyong remained completely still, watching him. Sahyuk smoothly lit a smoke, took a drag, and added that if Gyong refused, it would be a massive shame, but both of them would simply have to volunteer their physical bodies for the overall prosperity of his business. Hearing this, Gyong began to infuse a strange, visible energy directly into his hand. He looked at Sahyuk and asked if he was supposed to be the alchemist. Gyong then shouted loudly, telling Sahyuk that he talked far too much for someone who had fled from America. In an instant, Gyong scattered his fingers, projecting his sharp energy straight towards Sahyuk to strike him down. Sahyuk moved with deliberate precision, dodging and weaving through the incoming projectiles without sustaining a single injury. The effortless way Sahyuk avoided the attack baffled Gyong. Sahyuk stood there looking remarkably powerful, observing the vampire's confusion. He told Gyong that it appeared the vampire thought he had been joking. Sahyuk mentioned that he highly preferred associates who could look at the larger picture. Just as he was about to finish his smoke, Sahyuk's muscles suddenly began to bulge beneath his clothes. He warned Gyong to be glad that it was not a full moon, asserting that if it were, the vampire's head would have flown off just now. Gyong glared at him intensely. He reasoned that the rumors surrounding this man were entirely true, concluding that Sahyuk was far from ordinary. Seeking to shift the dynamics, Gyong suddenly delivered a sharp kick directly to the grounded Han, sending the youth sliding across the pavement toward the wall. Han was already bloodied up from the previous exchange, and the unexpected strike caused him to cough loudly against the stone structure. Gyong smoothly took off his jacket, dropped it straight to the ground, and faced Sahyuk. He offered a proposal of his own, stating that the winner of their fight would take the kid. He took a firm combat stance, asking if that was not simple enough. Sahyuk broke into a frantic laugh at the suggestion. He told Gyong that he possessed better judgment than Solomon. Gyong scoffed, dismissing the friendly talk, noting that Sahyuk had only lived for a few decades compared to him. In an instant, Gyong dashed forward with incredible speed, launching a high kick aimed straight at Sahyuk's face. Sahyuk ducked slightly, dodging the blow completely. The two immediately engaged in a heavy brawl. Gyong unleashed a rapid follow-up kick towards Sahyuk's torso, but Sahyuk anticipated the movement and dodged the second attack just as smoothly. Sahyuk kept his composure, appearing slightly impressed by the vampire's mechanical movement speed. Despite the intensity of Gyong's wild swings, Sahyuk moved easily, bending his body to evade every single strike. Gyong unleashed a frantic flurry of consecutive attacks, but Sahyuk either slipped past the momentum or directly blocked the physical impacts with his arms, handling the pressure with total ease. A sudden sense of bewilderment hit Gyong as he backpedaled. He calculated the physics of the fight and deduced that this situation made absolutely no sense. He wondered how a regular human who had not even utilized the enhancement drug could block his vampire strikes so easily and exert this level of physical power against him. Noticing the hesitation, Sahyuk looked at him and remarked on the Chinese martial arts style Gyong was utilizing, stating that this was how the people who invented it actually intended for it to be done. Sahyuk delivered a devastating punch straight into Gyong's face. The impact sent Gyong tumbling wildly across the ground. The vampire managed to catch his balance and pull himself up, but his face had sustained massive damage from the single blow. Disorientation clouded his mind as he glared at Sahyuk, realizing that the man was not even going all out yet. Sahyuk casually waved his hand, welcoming Gyong to come forward and continue the match. He mentioned that he had watched quite a few John Woo movies in his time. Gyong was extremely angry, his face bloodied up from the impact of the punch. He screamed out that Sahyuk was really pissing him off. Dashing forward with everything he had left, Gyong shouted back that those movies were actually from Hong Kong, throwing himself back into the fight to continue the mounting confrontation. Just as Gyong launched his attack, Sahyuk easily dodged the next strike from him. The battle grew increasingly heated as it seemed as though Gyong was pushing Sahyuk back with sheer volume. Sahyuk kept on blocking all of the incoming attacks, smoothly deflecting the physical pressure, before noting to Gyong that he had gotten a bit faster. Gyong's hand began to materialize and become visibly harder as he continuously punched at Sahyuk. Suddenly, a massive explosion erupted directly in front of Sayuk, though it came completely not to his surprise. Gyeong smiled widely at the blast, asking how that tasted. Sayuk stood his ground amidst the heat and remarked that he had honestly thought they would settle this with their fists like real men, questioning if his overall expectations had been too high. Gyeong simply replied no. Gyeong immediately began to question how Sayuk was fully able to withstand that destructive attack without sustaining injury. Suddenly, Sayuk pulled a gun straight from his pocket and told Gyeong that if it was simply a matter of utilizing tactical techniques, he had a few tricks of his own up his sleeve. He began to fire multiple shots against Gyeong in rapid succession. Gyeong materialized a massive shield directly in front of him to dodge the incoming attacks from the bullets. But just then, one particular projectile came out from nowhere. It was a heavy bazooka round. Upon seeing the massive weapon deployed, Gyeong could only mutter that Sayuk was a son of a bitch. Instantly, a massive explosion erupted at that exact point. When the dust finally settled, Sayuk walked past the clearing and grabbed the unconscious Han. Unfortunately, he had not brought a blood extractor along with him. He looked down at Gyeong on the ground, telling the vampire to consider himself lucky as he prepared to take the prize he had actually come for. Gyeong slowly rose his head up through the debris, asking Sayuk what the hell he was, calling him a son of a bitch. Sayuk glared back down at him and simply stated, "Teddy bears." Gyeong was left completely surprised and confused by the response. Sayuk clarified his taste, mentioning that he highly preferred bears over dogs anyway. Upon saying that, Sayuk carefully lifted Han's body from the pavement and walked completely off, leaving Gyeong on the ground to fend for himself. Much later, at a different location, a man was standing directly in front of a vehicle guarding it. That was the driver keeping watch over the car. In that moment, Sayuk arrived in front of him with the body. The driver looked at the scene, questioning if this was supposed to be a kidnapping, but Sayuk simply told him to shut up and close the trunk already. As they drove, the driver spoke up and asked Sayuk why he had chosen to leave that vampire guy behind earlier. He reasoned that if the encounter was strictly about blood extraction, Sayuk could have just ordered his crew to handle it if he was only chasing the target. Sayuk responded by stating that if a person only chases immediate short-term profits, they can never truly become a successful businessman. He smoothly lit a smoke as the driver responded, asking his boss not to tell him that he meant exactly what he thought he meant. Sayuk confirmed the deduction, stating exactly. He reasoned that the Jeokyo clan must still have an esquire alive somewhere. He explained to the driver that to catch a truly big fish, a person always needs a completely different class of bait. Far behind them, Gyeong suddenly rose up from his disheveled state, his physical frame entirely battered. Something was completely wrong with his posture as he seethed, feeling extremely annoyed by the utter embarrassment of the battle that had just occurred. The scene then transitioned to a different place entirely, a designated children protection zone that was heavily under surveillance. Inside a quiet room, Han finally woke up from his deep slumber and rose up from the couch instantly. The moment he sat up, a voice cut through the stillness of the room, asking if his green-headed friend was finally awake. When Han turned his head toward the corner, he saw Sayuk glaring back at him with the driver standing silently behind him. Sayuk mentioned that perhaps it was because they had injected him with high-quality vampire blood, but his physical wounds had healed remarkably quickly. Hearing this, Han was taken completely aback as he wondered where exactly he was. Sayuk bypassed the question entirely, stating that to do proper business in Korea, a person absolutely needs a nice office space. As he explained, it was revealed that Sayuk had already acquired a massive office within Korea. Sayuk then asked Han what his actual name was. Han shook his hand firmly and introduced himself. Sayuk introduced himself in return, noting that they were finally introducing themselves properly. Han glared toward him, maintaining his posture, and thanked Sayuk for his help. Sayuk waved it off, stating there was no need for thanks because it was only natural for fellow hunters to help each other out. Sayuk mentioned that, anyway, taking on that vampire guy yesterday was pretty impressive. He added that even though the Jeokyo clan had lost its original historical edge, that guy was still a pretty big shot in the underworld. Han kept his gaze fixed on him, his mind analyzing the statement. He wondered what exactly Sayuk had seen from that brutal battle, concluding that all he had actually done was get heavily beat up by the guy. Sayuk then looked at him and stated that he would like to offer the exact same proposal he had made back at the cafe once again, asking Han what he thought about it. He added that their organization was heavily short on personnel, so they were in desperate need of an extra hand right now. Han pondered the job offer for a long second. The driver suddenly called out to Sayuk, pointing out that they still did not even know this young guy's true identity or background. Sayuk turned to his driver and asked if anyone had vouched for him when he first started out as a vampire hunter. The driver looked down, admitting that, well, no one had. Sayuk smiled, stating exactly, and asked why a real vampire hunter would ever need a formal identity anyway. Sayuk called for silence in the room, and then said that they should now go back to talking about their business. He glared at Han and explained that, for starters, a person in this line of work received a base salary of 2 million won a month, and blood packs were circulated at an exchange rate of 10,000 won per VT. Sayuk then decided to use that guy Gyeong from yesterday as a clear example. He noted that Gyeong was a high-class vampire with an estimated VT of around 9,800. Even taking into account the unique traits of the Jeokyo lineage that occasionally cause them to turn into corrupted entities, a VT of 9,800 remained incredibly valuable. Sayuk added that a person could walk away with 100 million won for just a single blood pack. Han calculated the numbers in his head and knew that for those who became vampire hunters simply to make money, what Sayuk just said must be a very tempting offer, which was completely true. But Han shifted his stance and mentioned that he had a question. He asked how exactly vampire blood was used to make money, reasoning that ordinary people would not even know that these creatures existed. Sayuk explained that, naturally, the acquired blood was refined and sold as illicit drugs or used for specialized medical treatments, with the source kept completely anonymous, of course. Sayuk continued, explaining that in places like Japan, rumors indicated that a certain cult leader had utilized it for his own purposes. He stated that vampire brokers did the exact same thing by turning the material into drugs to make a profit. Sayuk looked firmly at him and pointed out that even without joining the crew, Han was already a steadfast accomplice in this hidden economy. Sayuk then sharpened his gaze and mentioned that he had a question of his own. He asked Han about Father Sylvester, wanting to know exactly how capable that man truly was. Han sensed the shift in the conversation and understood the situation completely. He deduced that this information was the man's real goal, realizing that this was exactly why Sayuk had saved him from the pavement yesterday. Han responded by stating that Sylvester possessed a sword that was as tall as he was, which he swung around like a fan, and that he could fire a heavy Barrett rifle one-handed like a pistol, concluding that was about all he knew. Sayuk noted that an M82 Barrett rifle was certainly impressive, but he felt like that level of physical power was still a bit lacking to hunt down a true vampire. He asked if there was anything else Han could share, adding that rumor had it that the true vampire hunter Sylvester had been excommunicated from the Vatican over 200 years ago. Hearing this, Han was taken completely aback. He recognized that Sylvester was probably not a normal human, but to think his mentor had lived that long was startling. Since the man was not even a vampire, Han found himself confused about how such longevity was possible, though it did explain how Sylvester was able to display that massive kind of power without even using the psychedelic moon enhancement. More importantly, Han recognized that this guy Sayuk possessed an incredible amount of information. Han kept his composure and simply said that who knows, since the old man did not use the enhancement drug anyway. Sayuk sighed, asking if that was truly all Han knew. He mentioned that it was a real shame, explaining that since the two had traveled together, he figured Han would be someone Sylvester trusted with his secrets. Han felt the tension in the room rise, gathering that he might have outlived his overall usefulness to these people. He stated that the veteran vampire hunter simply didn't have any chance or need to use the psychedelic moon, and as he spoke, he tried to quietly place his hand into his pocket. Our boy was reaching for his weapon just in case things went south. He added that Sylvester did not trust anyone to begin with. Sayuk immediately noticed the subtle hand movement and began to laugh out loud at Han's caution. He told Han not to be so tensed up, reminding him that they were still comrades fighting against vampires together. Sayuk asked if Han really thought he would do something harmful to him right there in the office. He remarked that it seemed he had pushed their little sprout of a hunter a little too hard. Han relaxed his posture slightly, becoming more comfortable as the immediate threat dissolved. Sayuk then said that as an apology for the pressure, he would show Han their underground workshop. He asked if Han happened to know why people in the underworld called him the alchemist. Han responded that he had a rough idea. Sayuk smiled and said that he would make absolutely sure Han found out the complete truth today, because his process was far more efficient than turning lead into gold. The scene transitioned to a dark, heavy space underground where Sayuk was escorting Han down the corridor. Sayuk explained that humans used to live as simple hunter-gatherers until they finally understood the laws of nature and transitioned into organized agricultural and pastoral societies. Yet, he noted, vampire hunters today still had not moved past that primitive phase, choosing to live like ancient hunter-gatherers. Sahyuk pointed out that was absolutely no way to run a sustainable business. He told Han to take a good look as they finally arrived at their destination. The heavy doors slid open, and Sahyuk mentioned that this was the first time he was ever giving an outsider a view of what was held inside here. The moment the doors fully opened, Han was completely shocked by the horrific sight in front of him. There were a large number of captured creatures being hung up by their limbs, looking exactly like slaughtered cows hung up in a butcher shop. Directly under their suspended bodies, their blood was continuously leaking down, dripping steadily into plastic buckets placed on the floor. Sahyuk looked at the operation and asked if the sight was not absolutely beautiful, calling it the blood-based agricultural society that he had successfully built. Han stared at the gruesome scene, completely horrified, cursing under his breath and asking what the hell this was supposed to be. Sahyuk laughed, noting that it seemed their green-haired friend was also marveling at his genial business model. Sahyuk then slowly bowed in front of the rows of suspended bodies, turned back to Han, and formally welcomed him to his private vampire